Tonight we're going somewhere real. Somewhere your great-grandparents may have actually lived, breathed, and survived. We're talking about the true, textured, everyday reality of being a Black American in the 1950s. Not the sanitized paragraph from a school textbook, but the actual rhythm of a life. The smell of biscuits at dawn, the sound of a gospel choir through an open window, the careful math of a bus ride, and the quiet, relentless dignity it took just to get through an ordinary Tuesday. Before we start, if you're enjoying this channel, a like and a subscribe helps more than you know, only if you genuinely mean it though. And if you'd rather just close your eyes and listen, we're on Spotify now too, links in the description, all right. Dim the lights, get comfortable, let your body sink into the mattress. Tonight, you're not watching history, you're living inside it. It's 1953. Somewhere in America, a radio is warming up, coffee is on the stove, and the whole country outside your door still hasn't quite made up its mind about who you're allowed to be. Let's begin. You wake in the gray hush before the alarm, the way you always do. Maybe you're in a cramped kitchenette apartment on Chicago's South Side, the walls so thin you can hear your neighbor's radio through the plaster, your whole family squeezed into rooms that used to be one apartment before a landlord carved it into three and charged full price for each slice. Or maybe you're in a small wood frame house in rural Alabama, where morning arrives straight through the gaps in the boards, uninvited and cold. Either way, the day begins the same, early, aching, and entirely, stubbornly yours. Let's take stock of where you actually are. If your family came north during the Great Migration, and by the 1950s, millions had you know the story. You packed a single suitcase, boarded a train out of the cotton fields, and carried a scrap of paper with a cousin's address pinned inside your coat pocket like a promise. You traded one kind of trouble for another. The South had its open cruelty, spelled out on signs. The North had a quieter cruelty, the kind that smiles at you and then somehow never has an apartment available, never has an opening on the assembly line, never quite gets around to promoting you. That kitchenette apartment tells the whole story on its own. It was probably a real apartment once, before somebody figured out they could divide it into 3 units and charge triple the rent, because the housing market had already decided Black families weren't allowed to live just anywhere. One bathroom shared down the hall between 3 households, a single hot plate standing in for a kitchen. It costs more per square foot than the spacious apartment the white family 2 neighborhoods over is renting for less. That's not bad luck. That's the system working exactly as it was built to. But this cramped little apartment is also full of your people, your smells, your noise. Someone's already got the coffee percolating. Someone's negotiating loudly for the bathroom. A baby is registering a formal, high-volume complaint about being awake at all. The radio crackles to life and fills the room with a voice, and the day has officially begun whether you agreed to it or not. You lie there one more second, doing what everyone does before a long day, negotiating quietly with the ceiling. Your body carries a tiredness that doesn't come from ordinary work. Your feet remember yesterday. Your lower back is keeping a detailed record. You are, for what it's worth, still fairly young. This life just ages a person faster than it should, the way an engine wears out quicker when it's driven hard, every day, over roads nobody ever bothers to repave. And yet, you get up anyway. That's the part the textbooks tend to skip. You swing your feet onto the cold floor and you start the day with your dignity already strapped on because you're going to need every bit of it before lunchtime. You're not a symbol this morning. You're not a movement. You're just a person who has somewhere to be, same as anyone, in a country that keeps forgetting you count as a person at all. So you rise. You work the aches out of your shoulders. You reach for the day like it belongs to you, because that part, at least, they can't take from you. The coffee's nearly ready. The shirt needs pressing. And before your foot ever touches the pavement outside, there's a small, sacred ritual to attend to, making yourself look every bit like the somebody you already know you are. Let's talk about getting ready, because in your world, how you walk out that door matters more than you might expect. The shirt gets ironed with real focus, the crease sharp enough to leave a mark. If you're a man, maybe there's a fresh cut waiting at the barbershop, maybe a conk that cost you both money and a fair amount of physical courage. If you're a woman, the hot comb is already warming on the stove, and Saturday's trip to the beauty shop is half grooming, half sanctuary. None of this is vanity. In a country that has decided in advance to see you as less sloppy, careless, beneath notice looking sharp is a quiet daily rebuttal. You might own exactly 2 good shirts. That's fine. Those 2 shirts are going to be flawless. You learn this by watching your own parents do the same thing every single morning of your childhood. A crisp collar in a world that expects you to look shabby is a small act of defiance you wear straight out the front door. You're refusing the costume the country tried to hand you. The shoes get the same care. Spit, rag, elbow grease, until you can nearly catch your own reflection in the toe. There's an entire philosophy folded into a well-shined pair of shoes. You can't control much of what's waiting for you out there today, but you can control this. You can make certain that when you walk into a room where you're not particularly wanted, you walk in looking better than the welcome you're about to receive. Now, the hair. For the men, there's the barbershop, and there's also the conch, that slicked, straightened style that required harsh chemicals, a strong stomach, and a genuine tolerance for scalp burn. The straightening compound of the era was frankly close to lie. Picture willingly applying something like oven cleaner to your own scalp and then sitting motionless, eyes watering, negotiating silently with the sting, all in service of the look. Beauty has always demanded a bit of suffering from people. This particular decade simply demanded more than its share. For the women, the ritual is its own quiet art form. The hot comb heats on the stove burner until the temperature is exactly right, too cool, and it accomplishes nothing. Too hot, and you've scorched both hair and ear in the same unforgettable instant. Every black woman of a certain generation can describe, in precise detail, the sound of that comb being tested against a damp cloth, and the specific flinch that comes when it strays too close to the neck. It's a bit like ironing, except the fabric is attached to a living person who is deeply, understandably opposed to the entire process. And then there's Saturday, the beauty shop, which, like the barbershop, is worth far more than the sum of its services. It's the news wire, the gossip circuit, the group therapy session, the community hub, all rolled into a few precious hours where nobody in the room is the help and nobody is treated as a problem. You walk in exhausted. You walk out transformed. And somewhere in that chair, you also catch up on absolutely everything happening on your block. The larger truth underneath all of it: presentation was armor. In a country primed to read you as lazy or dangerous or dirty, none of it true, all of it assumed on sight, a sharp crease and a polished shoe talked back before you'd said a single word. You dressed for a respect the country wasn't offering freely. And by dressing for it anyway, you insisted on it regardless. So you checked the mirror one final time. Sharp, ready, undeniable. And now that you look the part, your stomach reminds you it's time for the other morning ritual, the one that happens at the stove. Breakfast in your kitchen is a small daily miracle, performed without anyone ever calling it that. Grits soften slowly on the stove, stirred by whoever got there first. Maybe there are eggs this week, if the paycheck stretched far enough. Biscuits rise in the oven from a recipe that exists nowhere on paper, because nobody in this family has ever needed it written down. This is the food that history will later dignify with the name soul food, born from taking the cheap cuts, the leftover greens, the parts of the animal nobody else wanted, and turning them into something worth setting an alarm for. You eat quickly because the clock has never once cared about your feelings. But you eat well because your grandmother would rise clean out of her grave if you didn't. Let's give the grits their due because they've earned it: cheap, filling, endlessly forgiving. Dress them up with butter and a little cheese if you have it, or eat them plain and be grateful either way. They are the quiet workhorse of the southern morning, and when the Great Migration carried families north on crowded trains, the grits came right along, refusing to be left behind in the cotton fields. A single pot of grits has carried entire families through entire hard seasons. No complaints, no fuss, low overhead, steady as a heartbeat. If it's been a decent week, there are eggs. Maybe a strip of fatback or a little salt pork for flavor, because nothing in this kitchen is wasted and everything is expected to earn its place. This whole cuisine grew directly out of scarcity and, through sheer stubborn ingenuity, turned scarcity into genius. That's the deep magic sitting quietly inside soul food. It's what happens when a people are handed the discarded parts of the animal, the greens that grew wild along the fence line, the driest cornmeal, and told simply to make do. And instead of merely making do, they make something so good that, decades later, the entire country will be lining up and paying restaurant prices for a plate of it. That's not making do. That's alchemy, performed quietly in a kitchen nobody outside the family will ever see. The biscuits are their own private religion. There's no recipe card, because the recipe doesn't live on paper. It lives in a pair of hands, in a pinch of this and a feel for that, in a kind of knowing that can't really be written down, only absorbed slowly over years of standing at your grandmother's elbow, watching, memorizing without meaning to. Every family swears its biscuits are the best biscuits in the world, and every single family happens to be correct, and we are not going to argue about it tonight. There's a rhythm to the whole meal, too. Breakfast in this house isn't something you eat standing alone over the sink, scrolling through nothing, the way it might be decades later. It's loud. It's communal. It's the last full gathering before everyone scatters into a day that's going to test each of them differently. Somebody says grace, quickly but sincerely. Somebody's running late and says so with their mouth full. Somebody younger gets fussed at about the state of their shoes. The coffee is strong enough to file a formal complaint against. And through all of it, a full meal gets made from very little and shared without anybody giving it a second thought. Because feeding your people well is simply one of the ways you love them out loud. There's a quiet lesson folded into that biscuit dough, and the whole community seems to live by it without ever stating it directly. You take whatever the world hands you, however meager, and you refuse to let it stay meager. You add care. You add skill. You add generations of hard-won knowledge. And somehow you turn a handful of cheap ingredients into a table worth gathering around. That instinct never stays contained inside the kitchen. It's the exact same instinct that will, block by block, build an entire self-sufficient neighborhood out of the scraps of opportunity the country is willing to allow. You wipe the plate clean with the last corner of biscuit, because leaving food behind simply isn't done in this house. One more swallow of coffee that could probably strip paint. Somewhere a clock is being wildly unreasonable about how little time is left. And so you rise from the table, fed and fortified, and step outside into the one place in this entire country that is warmly, unquestionably yours, your own street. For a few blocks, the world actually makes sense. This is your neighborhood, Bronzeville, Sweet Auburn, the Hill District, wherever home happens to be for you, and it hums with an entire life the wider country rarely bothers to notice or acknowledge. Black-owned barbershops, funeral homes, insurance men making their rounds door to door, corner groceries where the owner knows your mother by name, a doctor, a dentist, a weekly newspaper, an entire self-made economy built because it had no other choice but to build itself. On your own street, you're not a problem that needs managing. You're Mr. Carter. You're somebody's Sister Ruth. You're somebody's cousin home from up north for the summer. It's only once you step past these blocks that the day starts to get complicated. Take a slow look around, because what you're seeing is one of the great overlooked achievements of the entire century. The wider country locked your people out of its banks, its neighborhoods, most of its institutions. So your community simply built its own, brick by brick, dollar by dollar. If the white-owned banks wouldn't extend a loan, there was a black-owned bank that would. If the big insurance companies wouldn't write you a policy, there was a black insurance agent walking the block, collecting premiums 1 dime at a time. Patient as Sunday. If the hospitals turned you away at the door, there was a black doctor with his own shingle hung out front. It's an entire parallel economy, and by the 1950s it's thriving in cities across the country. Sweet Auburn, over in Atlanta, was once called the wealthiest Negro street in America, and it wore that title well. Banks, insurance offices, churches, and businesses lining a stretch of road that pulsed with ambition and money that stayed circulating right there in the community. Bronzeville in Chicago was practically a city within a city packed tight by the walls of segregation, but absolutely bursting with music, commerce, and culture in spite of it. Durham had its own version, a strip so prosperous it earned the nickname Black Wall Street. None of this happened by accident. This is simply what happens when talented, driven, ambitious people are told they're not permitted to play in the main arena. So they go build a better one, a few streets over, on their own terms. Walk it with me for a moment. There's the barbershop, already warming up its daily argument about last night's ball game. There's the funeral home, run by a man of genuine standing in the community, because in a place that faced death so often and received so little outside help, the undertaker was a pillar, dignified, prosperous, and never short of work, however grim that fact might be. There's the corner grocery, where your credit is good and the man behind the counter has known your mother since she was a girl. There's the newspaper office, quietly printing the stories the mainstream papers won't touch. And there's the church, anchoring the whole street like a great stone keel holding a ship steady. And here's the part that outlasts everything else about that street. On it, you have your full name and your full self. Out there, past the invisible line that everyone can feel even when it isn't painted anywhere, you might be called boy at 50 years old, or handed a generic name that isn't yours at all, or simply not addressed as a person worth nomming. But right here, on this block, you're Deacon Carter. You're Miss Ruth, who taught half the neighborhood's children to read before they ever set foot in a schoolhouse. You're the man whose tomato garden the whole street stops to admire every August. You are known, and being known, really known, is its own form of wealth that no sign downtown could ever touch or take away. There's a hard truth folded into this beauty, though, and we shouldn't skip past it just because it's uncomfortable. This gorgeous, self-made world exists precisely because the wider country forced it into being through exclusion. The closeness was real, and it was chosen fresh every single day by the people living inside it. But the wall around that closeness was never something anybody on this street chose for themselves. Your community turned a walled-off yard into a garden, which is a genuine triumph of will and imagination. It also, by any fair measure, should never have had to be built in the first place. So you nod to your neighbors as you pass. You trade the morning's news on a street corner for exactly as long as good manners allow. You move through blocks where you are unmistakably somebody. It's warm here. It's entirely yours. But the job waits out there, past the edge of all this, and getting to it means facing the first real negotiation of the day, the one that begins the moment you step up onto the bus. Let's talk about that bus, because like nearly everything else in your day, it comes with its own particular system, and you've learned every inch of it by heart. You pay your fare at the front door, and in a number of cities, you're then expected to step back down onto the street and reboard through the rear door, because heaven forbid you walk the length of the aisle past white passengers already seated. You take your seat behind the invisible line, and if the white section fills up before the colored section does, you're expected to rise and hand your seat over without complaint. You've done this exact routine 10,000 times by now, without even having to think about the choreography anymore. Somewhere down in Montgomery, a woman named Rosa is doing this very same daily math, but we'll get to her later tonight when the moment is right. Consider, for a second, the sheer engineered absurdity of the whole arrangement. You board at the front. You drop your fare into the box. And then, in the cities that run it this particular way, you climb back down onto the pavement and walk the length of the bus on the outside, just to re-enter through the rear door, because you are never, under any circumstance, to pass bodily through the white section on your own two legs. If you're unlucky that morning, the driver simply pulls away the instant your foot touches the sidewalk, your fare already gone, your ride gone with it. You paid in full for a seat you never got to sit in, and there isn't a single thing you can do about it in the moment. It happened often enough that everyone on that street corner has a story about it, filed away and rarely mentioned out loud. Now you find your seat behind the line that divides the bus into two separate moral categories, the country invented out of thin air and enforces with the full weight of law. You settle in, minding your own business, on your way to work the same as everyone else riding this morning. But the line isn't fixed in place, it floats. As more white passengers climb aboard, the driver simply slides the line backward and back again, and you and everyone in your row are expected to rise and surrender seats you were already occupying, paid for in full, the moment you're told to. You run the same mental arithmetic on every single ride. How full is the bus already? How many stops remain before your own? Will you make it seated, or will you be standing the whole way, gripping a pole with one tired hand? Sit with the specific cruelty of the design for a moment. It isn't enough, apparently, to simply seat people separately. The whole system is engineered so that a black rider, no matter how exhausted from the week, must physically stand, so that a white rider, no matter how young or perfectly able-bodied, may sit comfortably instead. It's a machine built, quite deliberately, to manufacture humiliation on a fixed daily schedule, at a fare you already paid in full. And here's the thing the system never seemed to account for. Everyone riding that bus was keeping count. Every swallowed word, every surrendered seat, every driver who pocketed a fare and pulled off early. It was all going quietly into a great shared ledger, for years, for decades, riding upright and mostly silent. And a person, a whole community of people, can only absorb so much of that arithmetic before the sum finally, quietly comes due. You make it to your stop, finally, and you step down off the bus and square your shoulders, because whatever the ride put you through, that was only the commute. The real day is still waiting, and depending on who you are, it might begin in somebody else's kitchen entirely. For a great many black women in this decade, work means walking through the back door of someone else's home. You rise before dawn, ride clear across town on a bus that makes you stand, and spend the day raising children who aren't yours, scrubbing floors that aren't yours, cooking meals you'll never sit down to share. You might spend years half-raising a white family's children with more tenderness than the world has ever shown you in return, and be addressed by your first name only, or by no name at all, while you're expected to call every adult in that house Mr. and Mrs. without exception. The pay is thin. The hours stretch on without any real end in sight, and when the day is finally, mercifully over, you go home and start the entire routine again, this time for the people you actually love. Domestic work was, for millions of black women across the country, simply the job that existed. It was one of the narrow handful of doors the wider economy left open even a crack. You cooked. You cleaned. You did the laundry by hand or by wringer washer. You minded the children, sometimes for a single household, sometimes hopping between 2 or 3 different homes across a single week just to piece together enough income. The hours were whatever the family decided they were. There was no concept of overtime, no sick day, no such thing as a job that politely ended at 5 o'clock because the work ended precisely when the household said it ended, and not 1 minute sooner than that. The strangest cruelty tucked inside all of it was the sheer closeness of the arrangement. You were trusted completely with everything that actually mattered inside that house. The food on the table, the family's linens, the children themselves, sometimes even the household keys. And trusted with none of the basic respect that trust should have earned you. You'd rock a white infant to sleep in your own arms. You'd kiss its scraped knee and mean it. You'd come to know its every mood better than its own mother ever quite managed to. And still you'd be summoned across the house by your first name, like a child yourself, while everyone under that roof, right down to the toddler barely old enough to speak in full sentences, was addressed as Mr. or Mrs. to you, without exception, without a second thought given to the asymmetry of it. There's a particular kind of ache in spending your whole day raising another woman's children while your own child, across town, is being minded by a neighbor, or a grandmother, or an older sibling barely old enough for the responsibility themselves. You poured real tenderness into children who would, in 20 years' time, go on to inherit the very system pressing down on you and yours. Children who might, without ever meaning real harm by it, one day speak to your own grandchildren the way their parents once spoke to you. And still, you love them anyway most days, because you were simply the kind of person who couldn't bring yourself to do that particular work coldly. The love, whatever else was true, was completely real. It simply was never repaid in the currency it actually deserved. The pay tells you the rest of the story on its own. A few dollars for a day that began in the dark and ended in the dark. Carfare that ate steadily into wages already scraped down thin. Sometimes a small bag of leftovers pressed into your hands at the door on your way out. What some households called totting, which managed to be generous and quietly demeaning in the exact same gesture. A wage supplement made entirely of table scraps. And yet, watch closely what these women actually did with those thin, hard-won dollars. They put children through school year after difficult year. They kept struggling churches standing upright through lean seasons. They bought modest homes, one impossibly stretched payment at a time. They raised sons and daughters who grew up to become teachers, ministers, doctors, and organizers. The very people who would, within a decade or two, help tear pieces of the whole unjust system down. That paycheck itself was small. What eventually got built with it, patiently over years, was anything but. It's also worth being fully honest that these women saw everything. They knew the white households they worked inside from the interior out, every hypocrisy, every carefully kept secret, every contradiction between what a family preached on Sunday and how it actually behaved on Tuesday. They came to understand the people who employed them far better than they themselves were ever understood in return. That accumulated knowledge was its own quiet, private form of power, carried home at the end of the day, shared over kitchen tables, stored away for whenever it might eventually matter. So at the close of that long, doubled day, she rides the bus back across the invisible line separating one side of town from the other, tired down in her bones, and walks into her own house, where the second shift begins immediately, but where at long last she has her full name back, spoken with love by the people who actually know her. Her labor, that single day, built up two separate households. Only one of them ever thought to thank her properly. And across town, in the mills and the rail yards and the freight depots, her husband is running headfirst into a wall of his very own, one built from entirely different material, but just as solid, just as deliberate. For a great many black men in this decade, work means taking whichever jobs the country has decided are yours to have, and living every day beneath a ceiling built deliberately low, just above your head, so you can always feel it there. You might carry bags and make up berths on a passenger train as a Pullman porter, addressed as George by strangers, no matter what your actual name happens to be, smiling steadily for tips while quietly, patiently helping to run one of the proudest, most disciplined, best organized black labor forces in the entire country. You might sweat through a shift in a foundry, or a stockyard, or out in an open field under a punishing sun. You could carry the actual skill of a foreman and be handed only the title and the wage of a laborer, watching a far less capable man get promoted directly past you, and swallow that insult whole, because the rent is due on the first regardless of how you feel about it. Out here, dignity is something you learn to carry entirely on the inside, where nobody can strip it away from you by decree. Let's start with the trains, because the story of the Pullman porter is really an entire American story unto itself, for decades leading into this one. If you were a black man looking for steady work that came with a uniform and a dependable wage, the Pullman Company was hearing. To make up sleeping berths, shine shoes, haul heavy luggage, and attend to white passengers hand and foot, coast to coast, across the entire rail network. The base pay leaned heavily on tips, which meant your livelihood depended on performing cheerfulness for total strangers who called every single porter George, after the company's founder George Pullman himself, as though you hadn't arrived in this world already carrying a name of your own choosing. But here's the twist the Pullman Company never quite saw coming. Those very same porters, traveling constantly, talking to people in every city along every route, carrying newspapers and fresh ideas from one end of the country to the other, became, almost by accident, one of the most well-connected and worldly black workforces in the entire nation. And under the leadership of A. Philip Randolph, they organized the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the first major black labor union to successfully win a signed contract from a giant American corporation. The men the company had hired specifically to serve in polite, uncomplaining silence had gone and built themselves a genuine power base, organizers, quite literally, in bow ties, that would go on to help launch the wider civil rights movement still to come. Off the trains, the story turns considerably heavier. In the booming industrial cities of the North, factories were hearing, and black men were welcomed into that boom, welcomed specifically into its hottest, most dangerous, worst-paid corners. The foundry floor, the killing floor of the meatpacking plant, the jobs the system had already labeled unskilled, whether or not the work genuinely required real skill, because calling it unskilled was precisely how management justified paying so little for it. You did that labor, and you did it well, and it still never bought you a single rung up the ladder, because the ladder itself had been built with a ceiling fixed permanently in place, and that ceiling had your name already written on it before you ever walked through the front gate. You could master an entire trade over years of practice and still be kept forever in the role of helper. You could personally train the very white man who would then be promoted directly above you to become your supervisor. You could watch every clerk position, every desk job, every title with any real authority go, one after another, to men you yourself had quietly taught to do the work. The unions in a great many trades simply wouldn't let you through the door at all, which meant the good, stable, well-paid jobs were sealed shut behind a lock you'd never once been handed a key to. None of this was ever really about ability, and everyone involved on every side of it knew perfectly well that it wasn't about ability. It was about maintaining a lid deliberately, permanently, generation after generation. So you learned out of sheer necessity to carry your dignity somewhere the job itself could never quite reach it. You took real pride in the work itself, in doing it better than it strictly needed to be done, in the paycheck that kept your family fed and your children in decent shoes for school. You were a deacon come Sunday morning, a homeowner, however modest the house, a father. A man of genuine standing in a community that saw your full worth clearly, even when the factory time clock refused to acknowledge it existed at all. The job tried, every single day, to make you feel small. You simply, quietly, consistently declined the offer, and you passed something forward, too, to the next generation, the firm expectation that your own children would climb higher, through a door you had spent your whole working life holding open with your own tired shoulder. But climbing higher, as your family well understood, took money. And money, as it turned out, came wrapped inside a whole separate set of walls, most of them entirely invisible until you tried to walk straight through one. Let's talk plainly about money, earning it, keeping hold of it, and the invisible walls specifically built to keep it small no matter how hard you worked. When you try to buy a home of your own, you discover entire neighborhoods marked flatly off limits, your loan application denied because of a map drawn in red ink inside some office you will never once be allowed to enter. When you do manage, against the odds, to actually buy something, it very often costs you considerably more for considerably less. So the community leans hard on itself instead. The black-owned bank down the street, the burial society your family has paid into for years, the collection plate passed hand to hand at church, the neighbor who quietly spots you until payday without ever being asked twice. A single dollar bill might pass through a dozen different black hands before it ever finally leaves the block for good. That's not merely economics. That's survival, carefully and deliberately organized. Let's follow that red ink for a moment, because it's one of the quietest, and in the end, one of the most devastatingly effective weapons ever aimed at your community's future. Somewhere in a downtown office, appraisers and mortgage lenders sat drawing detailed maps of every American city, grading each neighborhood according to the supposed risk of lending money there. And the neighborhoods where black families happened to live got outlined carefully in red ink and labeled hazardous, not because of anything genuinely wrong with the houses themselves or with the people living inside them, but simply, plainly, because of who lived there. Redlining, people would eventually call it. An entire community declared a bad investment by bureaucratic decree, and then systematically starved of loans until that original declaration made itself come true, year after year. The effects rippled outward in every direction imaginable. No loans meant no realistic path toward buying a home, and no buying meant no building of the one asset that quietly makes so many American families wealthy across generations: home equity, passed down. While white families across town were being handed low-interest mortgages for brand-new houses in the booming post-war suburbs and told, in effect, to go build a nest egg for their children, you were locked entirely out of that same arrangement by a single color line drawn casually on a map in someone else's office. Two families, doing the same kind of work for the same kind of wages. One is handed a launching pad. The other is handed a wall. Multiply that single unfairness across millions of households in several full decades, and you've built an enormous wealth gap entirely on purpose, then acted surprised, generations later, that it still exists. And when you did manage, through sheer persistence, to buy anyway, the terms were very often rigged hard against you from the start. Shut out of conventional mortgages, many families ended up buying on contract instead, a scheme where you paid and paid and paid some more, without ever actually owning a single brick of the house until the very last payment cleared. Miss 1 month, for any reason at all, and you could be tossed straight back out onto the street with absolutely nothing to show for years of faithful payments. You paid more, for worse terms, with far less legal protection, for the exact same roof over your head that a white family down the street was buying outright with a standard 30-year mortgage. The system had found a clever way to charge you an extra tax, essentially, simply for being who you were. So, and this is genuinely the part worth sitting with and admiring, the community built its own entire financial world in response. Black-owned banks that would extend a loan when absolutely nobody else in town would. Burial societies and mutual aid clubs where every member chipped in a little each month, so that any family, when the worst happened, could bury their dead with real dignity intact. An enormous, ever-present concern in a community that faced so much loss with so little outside help. The church collection plate, quietly funding far more than the church building itself ever let on. Informal savings clubs, sometimes called partners or susu clubs depending on the neighborhood, where a rotating group of neighbors pooled their money together and took turns drawing out the full pot when their own turn came around. When the mainstream economy slammed its doors shut, your people simply built a warmer, smaller economy of their own, right there inside the walls. And that single dollar, watch it travel once it enters the community. It comes in as a wage earned. It gets spent at the black-owned grocery on the corner. It gets deposited at the black-owned bank. It gets paid out to the black doctor down the street. It gets tithed faithfully to the church. It gets quietly lent to a struggling neighbor without a word of complaint. It circulates through the community again and again before it ever finally leaks out into the wider economy beyond the block. And with every single lap it makes, it strengthens the whole street a little more. That circulation wasn't sentiment. It was a genuine, deliberate economic strategy, and for a good stretch of time, it actually built real, tangible, visible prosperity along these self-made streets. None of it, of course, erased the underlying theft. The walls were entirely real. The wealth that was stolen, quietly, decade after decade, was entirely real. The head start denied to your own grandchildren before they were even born was entirely real. But within those walls, your community still managed its money the exact same way it managed everything else in this long, demanding day, with real ingenuity, with genuine solidarity, and with a flat, stubborn refusal to be made poor quietly, without a fight. Now let's talk about the signs, because by the 1950s they are absolutely everywhere. White only, colored, painted over doorways, mounted above water fountains, hung over waiting room entrances, posted at the threshold of the world itself. Picture for a moment the sheer scale of effort behind it all. A grown, industrialized society spending real money, real paint, real carpentry hours, real legal manpower, making absolutely certain two lines of ordinary human beings never once crossed paths unnecessarily. There were rule books written up for it. There were court cases argued over it, year after year. There were paid officials whose entire job description amounted to keeping a wall standing between two people who, more often than not, simply wanted to buy the same bottle of soda from the same cooler. History has produced very few things quite as elaborate, as expensive, and as staggeringly petty as the full machinery of Jim Crow. Let's actually sit with the logistics for a moment, because they're genuinely remarkable once you stop to count them up properly. Every single one of those signs had to be individually designed, ordered from a printer, paid for out of somebody's budget, and physically hung. Every segregated public building needed two of a great many things it could easily have gotten by with one of two waiting rooms, two full sets of restrooms, two separate entrances, sometimes two entirely separate buildings standing side by side for the same basic purpose. Somebody was employed, full-time, purely to enforce all of this. Somebody, somewhere, sued over it in court. Somebody else was paid to defend it in that same courtroom. An entire regional civilization poured a genuine share of its money, its labor, and its legal brainpower into the single, all-consuming project of keeping people apart at the water fountain. It's worth pausing to imagine, honestly, what might have been built instead with all of that same effort, had it ever been aimed at something useful. The rules themselves, in practice, often carried the strange internal logic of a fever dream. In some towns, you weren't permitted to play a public game of checkers together, across the color line in the town square. In others, the law specifically dictated separate Bibles be kept on hand for swearing oaths in the courtroom, as though the sacred words printed inside might somehow become contaminated by whose hand had touched the cover last. There were detailed rules governing which window of a shop you could be served through, which staircase you were permitted to climb, in what order customers of different races could be waited on at a single counter. The whole rickety structure was propped up by the polite legal fiction of separate but equal, a phrase that managed to be false in both of its words simultaneously, since the arrangement was never actually equal, and was, in fact, carefully designed from the outset to make sure it never could be. And notice, if you will, exactly where the signs tended to concentrate most heavily right at the ordinary moments of daily life. Getting a drink of water on a hot afternoon, using a public restroom, waiting for a train on a station platform, trying on a hat before buying it, eating a simple sandwich at lunchtime. The system, on the whole, didn't bother itself much with the grand, dramatic occasions of life. It quietly colonized the small ones instead, the dozens of tiny, mundane transactions that every single person has to complete just to get through an ordinary day as a human being. That was the actual design, working exactly as intended. The message needed delivering constantly, at every single mundane turn, so that you could never once, for even a single afternoon, forget your assigned place in the whole arrangement. Now, having described a fair amount of this pettiness with a certain wondering fascination, because the pettiness genuinely is remarkable and worth marveling at, let's also be entirely clear-eyed about what sat underneath it the whole time. Those signs were never merely rude. They were the visible tip of a system that was enforced, whenever it felt the need to be, with everything ranging from sudden job loss all the way up to outright violence. The sign hanging politely over the door was, in its own way, the friendly part. What stood behind that sign, ready to back it up, was not friendly at all. The entire apparatus functioned precisely because everyone involved on both sides of the line understood perfectly well that the pleasant little placard was standing in front of something considerably darker. Which is exactly why you learned from a very young age to read these signs the way a farmer reads weather, automatically, constantly, almost without consciously trying. Where can I go today? Where specifically can I not go? Where's the back entrance I'm meant to use? Which particular fountain is mine? Which specific window am I served through? It becomes a kind of second sense, an internal running map that everyone in your community carries around in their head from childhood onward, and quietly updates all day long, every single day, without exception. Children absorb it early, often before they fully understand why. It costs real, measurable mental energy every single day, just to navigate a world booby-trapped with this many rules. So you move through the signs the way you always have, expertly, wearily, missing absolutely nothing. And of all the places where the signs manage to turn the ordinary business of living into a genuine obstacle course, none is smaller, sillier, or more revealing of the entire rotten underlying logic than the two loneliest little battlegrounds in the whole town, the water fountain and the restroom door. Which brings us, quite naturally, to exactly that. You're thirsty on a hot afternoon and there happen to be two fountains mounted side by side, and you already know, without even needing to look closely, which one is meant for you. Need a restroom while you're downtown running errands. There may very well not be one for you at all, anywhere nearby. So you learn to plan your entire day around your own body's simplest, most basic needs. These aren't the dramatic cruelties that tend to fill up history books years later. They're the 1,000 tiny ones instead, the daily paper cuts of a system deliberately designed to remind you, at every single fountain and every single doorway, exactly where it wanted you to stand and stay. Look closely at the two fountains standing side by side, because together they tell you absolutely everything you need to know. The white fountain is very often the nicer one, gleaming porcelain, properly chilled, mounted at a comfortable height for an adult to use easily. The colored fountain, standing right beside it, is frequently a sad little afterthought by comparison. Sometimes just a bare spigot sticking out of the wall, sometimes not cooled at all. Sometimes tucked awkwardly around a corner where you genuinely have to go looking for it. Same water, quite often running through the exact same pipe underground, feeding both fountains from a single source. The country went to the considerable trouble and expense of installing two separate fountains, side by side, purely so that you would never once have to share the apparently profound danger of a simple drink of water with a white stranger standing nearby. It is, said plainly out loud, one of the most genuinely ridiculous sentences a modern society ever committed real money and real plumbing to. The restroom situation, if anything, was considerably worse, because it moved past silly and straight into something genuinely cruel. In a great many downtown business districts, there simply was no restroom available to you at all, not a poor one, not a distant one, none whatsoever. Which meant that a black family heading downtown for a full day of errands had to plan the entire outing around that single fact, the way a general plans a military campaign. Go before you leave the house. Don't drink too much water along the way, no matter how hot the day gets. Know in advance exactly which few businesses will actually let you use their facilities, and hope, quietly, that the day doesn't run long enough to become a genuine problem. A grown adult, a human body with the exact same basic needs as any other human body, forced to organize an entire day's outing around the single question of where, precisely, am I permitted to be a human being today? Think for a moment about what that kind of constant calculation does to a person, hour after hour, year after year. It's not the sort of thing that ever made front-page news anywhere. Nobody wrote a headline about a man who simply couldn't find a cold drink of water downtown, or a woman who had to sit through an entire day's discomfort because the town in question never bothered to build her a proper door to walk through. But these were exactly the paper cuts. And paper cuts, accumulated by the thousands, were how the system actually did most of its real, lasting work. Not through the rare, spectacular horror that makes it into the history books, but through the relentless, grinding, everyday drip of "you don't belong here," delivered quietly at the fountain, at the door, at the counter, 100 times over in a single, ordinary week. There was a particular weight to teaching all of this to a child. A small child genuinely doesn't understand why she isn't allowed to drink from the prettier fountain sitting right there in front of her, gleaming and inviting. And you, as the parent standing beside her, have to somehow find the words to explain something that has no good explanation whatsoever. Because the honest answer, because a great many powerful people, over a great many years, decided to be deliberately cruel about a drink of water, isn't something a 5-year-old can reasonably be expected to hold inside her small chest. So you improvise instead. You find some gentler, partial version of the truth. And you carry, quietly, the private ache of watching your own child bump into that particular wall for the very first time, knowing full well it's only the first of 10,000 more still waiting ahead of her. And yet even here, even at the fountain, people found real ways to keep their dignity fully intact. You didn't let the shabby, uncooled spigot define your own worth. You drank your water. You kept your head up on the walk back to the car. You refused quietly but completely to accept in your own heart the lie the plumbing itself seemed determined to tell you. The signs insisted, day after day, that you were less. You knew with total and unshakable certainty that you were not. And you passed that certainty down through your family like an heirloom worth considerably more than any fountain standing in any town. Because here's the one thing the architects of all this careful pettiness never quite managed to understand. You can absolutely control where a person is allowed to drink. You cannot, no matter how many signs you paint, control what that person privately knows about themselves. And what your community knew deep down about itself was about to start reshaping the entire country, one generation at a time. Let's go shopping, or more accurately, let's try. You walk into a downtown department store with real money sitting in your pocket, the same as anybody else browsing the aisles that afternoon, and you discover almost immediately that your money is perfectly welcome, while you yourself, as a person, plainly are not. You're permitted to buy the hat. You are not permitted to try it on first. You're permitted to buy the dress. There's simply no fitting room made available to you. And if it turns out not to fit properly once you get it home, well, that unfortunate outcome is now entirely your own problem to solve. The clerk on duty helps every white customer in the store first, as a matter of routine, and then, eventually, perhaps gets around to you. So you learn, out of sheer necessity, to shop with your eyes and your memory instead of your hands, to guess your correct size from clear across the room, and to hold on to both your receipt and your composure with equal care. Start with the strangest wrinkle running through this entire arrangement. Your money, notably, spent perfectly well in that store. The store, quite plainly, wanted your money. That particular part was never remotely in question. What the store objected to, specifically, was your hands actually touching the merchandise before purchase, your body standing inside the fitting room, your presence in the store being treated as genuinely equal to the white shopper browsing the next aisle over. So the business built itself an entire system in which your dollar was fully, warmly welcome, while your basic dignity was left waiting politely at the door, which amounts to a genuinely impressive feat of somehow having it both ways at once. Take the hat counter as one small example. A hat is, by its very nature, a thing you generally need to try on. Heads, after all, come in different sizes, and a given style flatters some faces and not others. But in a great many stores of the era, a black customer simply wasn't permitted to place a hat on her own head for a test, because some white customer might, at some later date, come in and want to buy that very same hat off the same shelf, and the store had already decided as a matter of policy that such a thing was simply unthinkable. So you learned to hold the hat up at arm's length instead, judge it as best you could by eye, imagine how it might actually sit, and buy it essentially on faith. The same went for dresses and coats. No fitting room was made available to you at all, so you developed, out of sheer repeated necessity, an almost supernatural talent for eyeballing a garment straight off the rack and knowing, to within a quarter inch, precisely how it would fit once you got it home. It's a bit like tailoring performed entirely by telepathy, a skill nobody in a fair world should ever have needed to master, mastered anyway by people who were simply given no other real choice in the matter. And if you happen to guess wrong on any given afternoon, well, in plenty of stores, that was simply the end of the transaction. No returns extended to you. No exchanges permitted. No opportunity to have the garment properly altered afterward, the way another customer might expect as a matter of course. You bought it, sight mostly unseen, and you owned your resulting mistake outright. A mistake, worth noting, that the store itself had actively engineered in the first place by refusing you the fitting room to begin with. You paid full retail price for a gamble the white customer standing 3 feet away never once had to take. Then there was the waiting itself, which could stretch on for a genuinely long while. You could stand patiently at a counter, cash already in hand, ready to complete your purchase, while the clerk worked steadily through every single white customer who walked in, including, not infrequently, customers who had arrived well after you did. Your turn would eventually come only once there was, quite literally, nobody else left in the store to serve ahead of you, which is simply a more polite way of saying your own time, as a customer, was treated as worth measurably less than everyone else's in the room. You stood there through all of it, patient on the surface, keeping a very careful lid on whatever you were actually feeling underneath, because making any kind of visible scene inside a downtown store was never a luxury a black customer of this era could realistically afford. So you shopped, out of necessity, with real strategy. You learned over time exactly which stores in town treated black customers with the least outright disrespect, and you gave those particular stores your steady, loyal business whenever you possibly could. You arrived with a written list and moved through the aisles with clear purpose, minimizing wasted time. You directed as much of your spending as you reasonably could toward the black-owned businesses back on your own block, precisely because there, and only there, you were treated as a genuine customer rather than a problem to be managed. And you held onto both your receipts and your composure in equal measure, because you could never quite know in advance when you might need proof of a purchase, or proof that you had handled some ugly moment downtown with considerably more grace than that moment had actually deserved from you. It wore on a person steadily, this constant low-grade negotiation attached to the simple, ordinary act of buying a thing you needed. But you carried it, day after day, the same way you carried everything else in this long day, with a straight back and a long, patient memory. And when the sun finally climbed toward noon and your stomach began asking its own pointed questions, you ran headlong into the next closed door of the day, the one fitted out with a row of shiny swivel stools you were never permitted to sit on. Now it's midday, and you've grown hungry, which, as it happens, turns out to be a surprisingly complicated problem to solve. That gleaming lunch counter with its cheerful row of red vinyl swivel stools is simply not available to you. If the restaurant is willing to serve you at all, it's typically through a side window or a back door, your food handed out to you almost like contraband, something to be quietly smuggled rather than openly served. So you learn to plan ahead instead. You pack a proper shoebox lunch fried chicken because it travels beautifully, a small slice of cake, maybe a few deviled eggs wrapped carefully in wax paper, the exact kind of meal that will one day be spoken of with real reverence, precisely because a hungry and dignified people refused, on principle, to ever be caught without a proper dinner of their own making. A closed door, in its own strange way, made your grandmother a considerably better cook than she might otherwise have needed to become. Take a moment to picture that lunch counter in its full mid-century glory, the chrome trim catching the light, the red vinyl stools that spin easily under a light touch, the pie case slowly rotating under its glass dome, the whole cheerful little theater of casual American belonging on full display. It is, in its way, the very picture of being able to simply walk in, take a seat, and be served a hot meal like you're somebody worth serving. And that precisely is exactly what it was not for you. You could stand nearby. You could smell the food cooking. You simply couldn't sit down on those particular stools because the stools themselves apparently carried some sacred quality you were not permitted to disturb. If the establishment fed you at all, it did so around the side, through a propped open back door, out of a small window cut into the alley wall. Your plate handed out to be eaten standing up, or in the car, or on the walk away. Anywhere at all except the actual room where the food had just been cooked. There was an entire unwritten grammar built around it, a whole set of unspoken rules governing precisely how a hungry black customer could, and could not, be served in any given establishment. All of it engineered in the end, so that no white diner seated comfortably at the counter would ever have to witness you eating a meal with the ordinary dignity of a seated human being. So your community, once again, simply outprepared the problem. Enter the shoebox lunch, one of the genuinely quiet culinary triumphs to come out of this whole difficult era. If you were traveling or simply heading somewhere downtown that wouldn't have you at its counter, you packed your own proper meal, and you packed it exceptionally well. Fried chicken formed the reliable anchor of it, because fried chicken happens to be a genuine genius of a travel food. It tastes just as good cold hours later as it did straight out of the pan. It holds up beautifully for an entire afternoon without spoiling, and it requires no reheating and no apology whatsoever. Alongside it went a pound cake or a slice of something sweet, a few deviled eggs, maybe some bread and a piece of fruit. An entire proper meal, portable and unmistakably proud, tucked carefully into a shoebox lined with wax paper. There's a lovely, quietly defiant logic buried right in the middle of that shoebox. The country, in effect, had announced, "We will not feed you with any real dignity," and your grandmother, without ever saying a word about it out loud, answered simply, "Fine, I will feed us considerably better than you ever could have managed. And we will eat like royalty in the back seat of the car, while your greasy little diner shrinks away in the rearview mirror." The exclusion itself was meant to shame. Instead, it quietly produced some of the finest road food this entire nation has ever known, along with a whole family tradition of careful preparation that people still speak of today with genuine reverence. That doesn't wash away the underlying insult, and we shouldn't pretend for a second that it does. Being denied a simple hot lunch, seated at a counter in your own country for no reason beyond the color of the hand reaching out to order, that's a small daily humiliation, but it carries real teeth all the same. The shoebox lunch was a genuine triumph, made necessary only by a genuine cruelty. Both of those things are true, sitting right next to each other at the very same time. But hold on to that image of the lunch counter for a while longer, those forbidden red stools sitting empty and gleaming, because within just a few short years, young people roughly your own children's age are going to walk calmly into places exactly like this one. Take a seat directly on those very stools, quietly order a cup of coffee, and simply, politely, refuse to leave. For now, though, you finish off the last of the chicken, brush the crumbs carefully from your lap, and turn your thoughts toward the bigger journeys. The kind where simply finding lunch turns out to be the very least of your worries. Let's take a trip, which, in your America, requires the kind of careful strategic planning most people reserve for a military campaign. A simple drive across 2 or 3 states means knowing, mile by mile, exactly where you can buy gasoline, use a restroom, get a meal, or find a safe place to sleep for the night. And just as critically, exactly where you absolutely cannot afford to stop under any circumstances. So you carry with you a small green guidebook, published specifically for travelers like you, listing out the hotels, restaurants, and private homes along your route that will treat you like the paying human being you actually are. You leave home with the car fully packed, the gas tank topped all the way off, and a shoebox lunch riding shotgun on the seat beside you. Because between here and your destination, there might easily sit 200 miles of open country where you simply are not welcome to stop for anything at all. It's the open road, dressed up in all its classic American promise of freedom, with a very large asterisk quietly attached to the bottom of the page. Let's talk properly about that green guidebook, because it stands as one of the most quietly ingenious documents to come out of the entire era. The Negro Motorist Green Book was a travel guide, published faithfully year after year, that told black travelers exactly where precisely they'd be welcome along any given route, which hotels would actually rent a room to a black family, which restaurants would serve a proper sit-down meal, which gas stations would let you fill your tank and use the restroom without incident, which private families, in towns with no hotel willing to take you at all, would open their own home to a traveling stranger for the night, for a small fee, out of simple decency. It functioned as part travel guide and part genuine survival manual, and for any family planning a road trip of real distance, it was every bit as essential to pack as the car itself. Think for a moment about what it actually means that a book like that had to exist at all. The open road was supposed to be the great defining American symbol of freedom itself. Just you, the car, and the horizon, free to go wherever the mood took you, whenever it took you there. And for you specifically, wherever you please arrived bundled together with an extremely detailed list of the narrow, specific places you were actually, verifiably allowed to go. The book existed in the end, precisely because that particular freedom didn't not fully, and certainly not for you. Somebody had to sit down, year after year, and painstakingly catalog the entire country's welcome and unwelcome, town by town, mile by mile, purely so that an ordinary family could reasonably expect to get from one city to the next without disaster striking along the way. So the trip itself became something closer to a campaign. You planned your route not by whichever highway happened to be fastest, but by whichever route was demonstrably safest, where the friendly, reliable gas stations were actually located, how far apart they sat from one another, and whether the stretch of road between any two of them could realistically be crossed on a single tank of gas. You packed the car as though you might not be able to purchase a single thing along the entire route, because, quite honestly, you very well might not be able to. The shoebox lunch rode up front within easy reach. Water came along in jugs. So did a healthy reserve of patience, a completely full tank, and a clear plan already worked out for every single leg of the drive ahead. The car itself, for all the very real headaches involved in planning around it, was also a genuine kind of gift in its own right. On a train or aboard a bus, you remained fully subject to the entire apparatus of segregated seating, the designated back sections, the seats surrendered on demand, the whole daily choreography of small humiliations performed in front of strangers. Inside your own car, though, you were sealed away inside a small, self-contained country entirely of your own making. Your family, your music, playing from your own radio at whatever volume you chose. Your own rules, set and enforced by nobody but yourself. No conductor could order you to move seats. No bus driver could put you off at the curb on a whim. That particular private freedom was worth a very great deal indeed, and it's a large part of why car ownership came to mean so much, so specifically, within Black America during this decade. It was a rolling piece of genuine dignity that you, and only you, got to control. But the car, for all that, couldn't fully protect you from whatever lay waiting just outside its windows. And that's exactly where the green guidebook earned its keep, and then some, mile after careful mile. Because stopping in the wrong town at the wrong hour wasn't merely inconvenient. It could turn genuinely dangerous, very quickly, without much warning at all. The whole elaborate system of advanced planning, the guidebook itself, the carefully packed car, the memorized list of safe stopping points, existed for one clear purpose: to keep a family safely away from exactly the kind of place we need to talk about plainly now. The stretches of the map that weren't merely unwelcoming in the ordinary sense, but that a black traveler needed to make absolutely certain of clearing well before the sun went down. And here we do have to slow down and speak plainly, because some parts of this particular map weren't just unwelcoming. They were genuinely dangerous. Scattered across the country, in every region, sat what came to be known as sundown towns, places where a black traveler unfortunate enough to be caught after dark risked considerably more than a rude word or a cold shoulder. Some towns posted signs directly at the town line, stating exactly what they meant, in plain language, without any real ambiguity. So you drove with a close eye on the sun the entire day, watching the light the way an experienced sailor watches an approaching storm front, making absolutely certain the wheels kept rolling well before dusk settled in. There's no joke to reach for here, and I won't pretend to find one, just the quiet, careful arithmetic of getting your own family home alive, calculated and recalculated all afternoon long. A sundown town was exactly what that grim shorthand name suggests, a town, and there were a great many of them scattered across the map, that tolerated black travelers passing through or even working locally during daylight hours, but did not permit them to remain within the town limits after dark. Some announced this openly, right at the town line, with a sign warning black travelers to be gone by sundown, no exceptions. Others enforced the exact same rule without ever posting a single sign, through the local police, through long-standing custom, through a threat that everyone in the area understood perfectly well without a word of it ever needing to be written down anywhere official. And these towns were never confined to the deep South alone. Sundown towns existed all across the country, in the North and the West included, a fact that tends to surprise people who would rather believe this particular ugliness belonged exclusively to somebody else's region. For a traveling family, this single fact reshaped the entire texture of any journey. The setting sun stopped being a pleasant, scenic backdrop to the end of a long day's drive and became, instead, a hard deadline you genuinely could not afford to miss. You watched the light constantly. You ran the calculation over and over throughout the afternoon. How many miles remained to the next confirmed safe stop? How quickly was the sun actually dropping toward the horizon? Would you clear this particular stretch of unfamiliar country before the sky turned fully orange? A delay that would register as nothing more than a minor annoyance for any other family on the road that same afternoon. A flat tire, a wrong turn taken, a long line at the one gas station willing to serve you, could very easily put your own family somewhere they genuinely should not be, once real darkness fell. I want to be careful and entirely honest here, because this is the part of the day where the polite little signs and the merely petty rules fall away completely, and you can finally see clearly what had always been sitting underneath them the whole time. The system that denied you a fitting room and denied you a proper seat at a lunch counter was, at its very foundation, backed up by the real and credible threat of actual violence. The sundown town is exactly where that underlying foundation showed itself plainly, without any polite cover story left to hide behind. It's the reason the green guidebook needed to exist in the first place. It's the reason the entire trip had to be planned out like a military operation. Not because your family was in any way fragile or overly cautious, but because the danger itself was entirely real, and pretending otherwise now would dishonor the sheer care it actually took, at the time, to move safely through a country that couldn't reliably be trusted to let you. So a father, driving his family carefully across 2 or 3 states, carried with him a kind of constant vigilance that no printed map could ever fully capture on paper. A running, quiet awareness of exactly where they were at any given moment, how they were being looked at by strangers along the way, and precisely how much daylight remained overhead. He kept the gas tank topped up so the car would never once be stranded. He kept the route tight and well planned. He kept his family close beside him and his own eyes fixed steadily on the horizon ahead. And he got them safely to their destination, trip after trip, year after year, through a landscape genuinely studded with places that meant them real harm, using nothing more than foresight, discipline, and steady nerve. There's a particular, quiet kind of courage sitting inside all of that. Not the loud, dramatic kind that gets written up and remembered with a statue somewhere downtown. The daily, unglamorous heroism instead of simply getting your loved ones home safe, one more time, through a country that couldn't always be trusted to let them arrive. Millions of families managed exactly that, trip after trip, year after year, and most of those countless careful journeys never once made it into a single history book. By any fair measure, they should have. And when the family finally did arrive somewhere safely, tired, relieved, deeply grateful, the destination that had made the entire dangerous trip genuinely worth taking was very often a place where children were supposed to be quietly building themselves a future. A schoolhouse, which, as it turned out, carried its own considerable set of troubles. Let's talk honestly about school, and about the promise it's meant to represent to every child who walks through its doors. Your children walk each morning to a schoolhouse that gets, quite literally, the leftovers of the district's budget second-hand textbooks arriving with another child's name already written inside the cover, worn-down desks handed down from the white school across town, a shortened school year specifically arranged so children can be pulled out early to help work the harvest when the crop demands it. Separate, the law insists firmly. And equal, which is a claim nobody within earshot is genuinely laughing at, because everyone involved already knows better. But something, quietly, is beginning to shift underneath all of it. In 1954, the highest court in the entire country finally says out loud, in plain legal language, exactly what your community had always known to be true from lived experience. That separate in practice was never once actually equal. The ruling itself arrives like a genuine sunrise. The long, difficult morning after it, though, is going to take a considerable while yet to fully arrive. Walk your child to that schoolhouse door for a moment and take a clear look at exactly what the country has actually provided. The buildings themselves are very often run down, heated poorly if they're heated at all, and packed well past any reasonable capacity. The textbooks arriving on the shelves are hand-me-downs from the white school across town, showing up with pages already missing and another child's name inked carefully inside the front cover. A small, silent daily lesson, printed right there on the flyleaf, about whose learning was always meant to come first, and whose was always meant to come a distant second. The classroom equipment is old and worn thin. Basic supplies run consistently short. And the actual dollar amount the school district spends per black student is, on average, only a fraction of what it spends per white student attending school across town. That's the separate, laid bare. The equal part was never really present in the building at all. On any given day, out in the rural South, conditions grew harder still. The official school year for black children was very often deliberately shortened. Classes let out early in the spring and started late again in the fall, arranged specifically around the cotton harvest, so that young hands could be put to work in the fields exactly when the crop demanded it most. Education, in other words, was scheduled around the community's immediate labor needs rather than around any child's actual future, which tells you, with real precision, exactly how much of a future the wider system had genuinely planned for these particular children to have. And still, the family sent their children to school anyway, every single morning, and still those children genuinely learned, because education itself was held sacred within your community in a way that consistently outran every single obstacle deliberately placed in front of it. That deep reverence for learning stands as one of the great connecting threads running straight through this entire story. A people who had, within living memory, once been forbidden outright by law from learning to read at all had turned around, within a couple of generations, and made education into something close to a holy pursuit. Parents who had received almost no formal schooling themselves scraped together every spare dollar and every spare hour to make sure their own children received considerably more. The black schoolteacher stood as a genuine pillar of the community, respected in exactly the same measure as the local minister or the local doctor. Learning was understood, without needing to be said aloud. As the ladder out, everybody in the community grasped that fact instinctively, even as the wider country kept quietly sawing away at the rungs whenever it could. And the teachers working inside those chronically underfunded schools worked genuine miracles with the little material they were given to work with. They stretched a single torn textbook and a worn-down stub of chalk into a genuinely full education. They knew every single child in their classroom by name, along with that child's whole family situation. They taught far more than arithmetic and basic grammar. They taught pride. They taught real history often left out of the approved textbook. And they taught exactly how to walk through a difficult world with your head held level and high. Underpaid, chronically under-resourced, and consistently undervalued by the wider society around them, these teachers built up an entire generation regardless. A generation that would go on to include, quite literally, many of the very young people who would soon be marching in the streets. Then, in 1954, the ground genuinely shifted in the landmark case of Brown versus Board of Education. The Supreme Court struck down, in a unanimous ruling, the entire legal fiction of separate but equal as it applied specifically to public schools, declaring plainly that segregated education was, by its very nature, inherently unequal, exactly what your community had been insisting all along, now stamped at last, with the full authority of the nation's highest court. It was a genuine sunrise, a real moment of tremendous hope, concrete proof that even walls that had stood for generations could actually, eventually, be moved through sustained effort. But a court ruling is, in the end, only words on paper, and words on paper have to be actively enforced out in the real world. And the resistance that met that particular ruling proved fierce and stubborn and dragged on for years afterward. School doors were physically blocked by armed state guardsmen. Local decisions were openly defied by governors. Real progress was fought over, inch by bitter inch, town by town, for the better part of a decade. And still, the light had genuinely broken through for good. Something fundamental had changed that could never fully change back to how it was before. And for a weary community, on the very day that decision finally came down from Washington, that alone was reason enough to lift your eyes a little higher than usual. Speaking of lifting your eyes, there was one place your community had always been able to do exactly that freely, without needing anyone's permission at all. When Sunday finally arrives, everything else in the week quietly falls away, because Sunday belongs entirely to the church. This is the true beating heart of your whole world, not merely a place to worship, but the one single building the wider society doesn't own any piece of, doesn't control, doesn't get a vote in. Here you're not somebody's servant and you're not treated as a problem to be managed. Here you're a deacon, a soloist standing before the choir, a trustee entrusted with real responsibility, a somebody plainly and fully. The choir lifts the roof clean off the rafters. The preacher builds a slow, patient fire that catches and spreads. And for a few precious hours, the entire congregation exhales together as one single body. The church will feed you when you're hungry. It will bury you with dignity when the time comes. It will educate your children. And before very much longer, it's going to organize an entire movement. Every great movement needs a headquarters after all, and yours already has a steeple sitting right there, waiting. Let's start with what the church actually was, in practical terms, because simply calling it a place to worship doesn't come close to covering it. The black church stood as the one major institution your community fully owned outright and fully ran on its own terms, top to bottom. No white board of trustees looking over anyone's shoulder. No color line running invisibly through the middle of the sanctuary. That complete independence made it something genuinely extraordinary. It functioned all at once as a house of worship, a town hall, an informal schoolhouse, a concert venue, a social club, an unofficial welfare office, and increasingly a political base of real consequence. In a world that controlled so very much of your daily life from the outside, here at last was a space that belonged to you entirely and gloriously. And on Sunday morning, it showed in every detail. You put on your very finest, the pressed suit kept specifically for this one day, the good dress saved carefully all week, the hat that clearly meant serious business, and you went to be among your people at their absolute best. The status the outside world had spent all week busily denying you was handed right back to you the moment you stepped through those doors. The man called boy at the mill on Friday afternoon was Deacon Carter come Sunday morning, respected openly, consulted seriously, treated plainly as a leader among men. The woman worn thin all week in somebody else's kitchen was, on Sunday, the president of the usher board, the anchor of the choir, a woman of genuine standing in her own right. The church restored, week after week, precisely what the outside world had spent the previous 6 days quietly stripping away. Then there was the sound itself. The music of the black church stands, without exaggeration, as one of America's genuine crown jewels. The choir swelling to fill every corner of the room, the organ rolling underneath it like a rising tide, the whole congregation joining in together until the building itself seemed to breathe in and out as one living thing. Gospel music came directly up out of these exact rooms. So did an entire way of singing that would go on to echo, unmistakably, through nearly every kind of American popular music that followed it, decade after decade. And the preaching itself, the slow, deliberate build, the call ringing out from the pulpit and the answer rising back up from the pews, the fire that started low and patient and rose gradually until the whole room was standing on its feet together. That was oratory as a genuine art form, performed fresh, week after week, in churches scattered all across the entire country. The church held the whole community together in the plainest, most practical ways imaginable, too. It fed families who found themselves running short that particular month. It buried the dead with real dignity when nobody else in town was willing to help. It took up special collections for the sick, for the newly widowed, for anyone quietly struggling. It ran after-school programs. It taught children their letters and their history both. It kept the entire social fabric of the community properly stitched together. If something genuinely needed doing anywhere in the neighborhood, odds were reasonably good the church was already quietly doing it, week after week, funded by nothing more than those modest collection plates passed hand to hand down every pew. But here's the part that would, before long, go on to shake the entire nation to its foundations. All of that hard-won independence, all of those regularly gathered people, all of that trusted leadership, that practiced organizing muscle, that accumulated moral authority built up patiently over generations. It added up, in the end, to the perfect engine for a movement, fully assembled and simply waiting for the right moment to be switched on. The church could assemble the entire community together at a moment's notice. It could help fund a cause directly out of its own collection plate. It had already, quietly, produced generations of leaders skilled in public speaking, in careful organizing, in moving a crowded room, including, as it happened, a young preacher down in Montgomery who was about to become a household name across the entire country. When the fight finally came, the black church didn't need to be built from scratch for the occasion. It was already there, standing strong, already gathered every single Sunday, simply waiting for its moment. For now, though, it's simply Sunday, plain and unhurried. The choir is singing. The preacher is climbing steadily toward his high point, and the whole community is exhaling together, unhurried in one shared breath. And when the sun finally goes down on that holy day, that very same community is going to find another kind of release entirely, because Saturday night had already come and gone the evening before, and Saturday night, as it happens, was a whole different kind of church altogether. Now, let's talk properly about the thing this particular decade does better than perhaps any other in American history, the music. Step directly into the sound of the 1950s, and you find yourself standing right at the birthplace of modern American music itself. Bebop crackling out of smoky, crowded clubs late into the night. Electric blues rolling up out of the Mississippi Delta and into Chicago, plugged in and turned loud. Gospel raising the rafters every single Sunday morning without fail. And something entirely new catching fire right alongside all of it. A driving new beat that white radio stations will, before too long, rush to rename rock and roll. Even though everyone on your own block already knows precisely where that sound actually came from. Your community is, quietly and without much outside recognition, composing the soundtrack of the entire century as it happens. The very least the century could eventually do, in return, is say a proper thank you. Let's trace the family tree here, because it really is a genuinely glorious one to follow. The blues came up originally out of the Deep South, out of the cotton fields, the front porches, the hard-earned wisdom of people who had learned, out of sheer necessity, how to turn suffering directly into song. When the Great Migration carried families north by the millions, the blues came right along for the ride. And in Chicago specifically, it got plugged in, electrified, amplified, sharpened into something newly urgent and considerably louder than before. That electric blues sound would go on to become the direct musical ancestor of nearly everything that followed it. The music itself migrated the very same way the people carrying it did, and it grew up remarkably fast once it hit the city. Meanwhile, over in the smoky late-night clubs, bebop was busily rewriting the entire rulebook on what jazz music could even do. This was jazz pushed to a dazzling new frontier of speed, harmonic complexity, and sheer daring improvisation. Musicians playing right at the absolute edge of what their instruments could physically do, inventing an entirely new harmonic language essentially on the fly, night after night. It was demanding music, brilliant music, cool in a way that would go on to define the very meaning of cool for generations of musicians still to come. These were, by any honest measure, some of the finest instrumentalists the entire country had ever produced, and they were quietly building genuine cathedrals of sound inside small rooms that most of white America never once bothered to walk into. On Sunday, of course, the gospel rose up as always, and gospel poured its raw fervor and its extraordinary vocal technique directly into the wider secular world beyond the church walls. The great voices of the era moved fluidly back and forth between the church and the stage, carrying that same underlying power along with them wherever they went. Rhythm and blues took the fire of the church and grafted it directly onto the sturdy backbone of the blues, and made something newly built specifically to move your body, not just your soul. And then, right around the middle of this very decade, all of these separate streams converged at once and caught fire together around a driving new backbeat, an irresistible new sound that would, within a few short years, sweep across the entire planet. Here, though, we do have to be honest about the century's rather poor manners. When that new crossover sound reached white radio, and white-owned record labels fully grasped just how much money was sitting inside it, the credit and the resulting fortune did not flow back evenly to the people who had actually created the sound from nothing. Black artists watched their own original songs get covered, note for note, by white performers who then received the radio airplay, the record sales, and the lasting fame, while the original songwriters received only a fraction of the profit, or sometimes nothing meaningful at all, or perhaps a polite nod of acknowledgement offered decades too late to matter much. America fell head over heels in love with the sound itself, while keeping a careful, comfortable distance from its actual source, which amounts to its own particular kind of segregation, just set neatly to a beat. And still, here is the genuinely remarkable thing: the creativity itself never once stopped flowing. Locked out of so much of the wider economy, your community poured its considerable genius into the one arena it could still fully, completely own outright: the sound itself. It invented, and then patiently reinvented, decade after decade, an entire river of music so powerful in the end that it became, without any real exaggeration, the actual soundtrack of modern American life, and a genuine gift handed generously to the whole world besides. Every guitar riff, every driving backbeat, every soaring vocal run that would go on to define popular music for the next half-century traces back, in the end, to these very rooms, these churches, these smoky clubs, these particular hands. So the music drifts out through the screen doors on a warm summer night, and it belongs to you completely, root and branch, regardless of who eventually got rich off the sound of it. It carried the whole community steadily through the hardest days, and it lifted the community higher still on the genuinely good ones. And nowhere, in the end, Did it lift higher than on the one single night each week when the entire neighborhood finally set its burdens down at the door? If Sunday belongs entirely to the Lord, then Saturday night belongs just as completely, entirely to you. The work week is finally done. The good clothes come back out of the closet, only this time not for church, but for pure, unfiltered joy. And the whole neighborhood comes alive at once. Maybe it's a juke joint sitting down a dusty back road. Maybe it's a jumping club in the very heart of the city. Maybe it's simply somebody's front room, the rug rolled up and pushed against the wall, a record spinning steadily on the turntable. There's dancing happening that would genuinely scandalize the very same church congregation you'll be quietly sitting beside again in 12 hours' time. There's laughter in the air that was earned the hard way, over a long and difficult week. For one single night, the doors that stay firmly shut all week simply don't matter anymore. Because in here, the party was never segregated to begin with. Let's properly set the scene because Saturday night carried a rhythm entirely its own. All week long you had been careful on the bus, careful inside the store, careful with your words, your posture, your entire face in a world that seemed to be constantly watching for any excuse at all. And then, finally, the work week ended, the wages sat safely in your pocket, and the pressure valve, at long last, was allowed to open. The good clothes came back out again, only this time not in service of respectability, but purely in service of having a genuinely good time. The whole point, tonight, wasn't to appear presentable. The point simply was to have a time worth remembering. Down south, the juke joint stood as the true temple of it all, a rough, unpainted building set out past the edge of town, a place your own community ran entirely on its own terms, where the blues played loud late into the night, and the dance floor stayed packed, and nobody in the room was managing anybody else's careful sense of dignity for once. Up north in the cities, the clubs jumped just as hard. Big bands and tight combos played to packed rooms full of people dressed to the absolute nines, dancing as though the whole difficult week had never once happened at all. And everywhere, in every city and every small town alike, there was the simple house party, arguably the best version of all. The rug rolled back against the baseboard, a record player or maybe just somebody's talented cousin at the piano, food and drink laid out on the counter, the entire block squeezed together, cheek to cheek, laughing. Sometimes that house party did quiet double duty, because rent, after all, was rent, and the apartment walls were always leaning in a little too close for comfort. The rent party stood as a genuine institution of real northern ingenuity. You'd throw your own apartment open on a Saturday night, charge a small fee right at the door, sell a bit of food and drink to cover costs, hire a piano player for the evening if you could manage it, and let the whole neighborhood pack in tight to dance the roof nearly off the building. By Sunday morning, more often than not, you'd made your full rent for the month. Survival and genuine celebration, braided together tightly into one loud, joyful, sweaty night. Only your community, it seems fair to say, could have invented such an effective way to have that much real fun while quietly, cleverly outmaneuvering the landlord in the same breath. And the dancing itself, the dancing was something else entirely. Inventive, athletic, genuinely electric, with entire new styles being born right there on those crowded floors, styles the rest of the country would be busily copying within the year, the same way it copied nearly everything else your community originated first. There was a real freedom in it that the daylight world, out there past the front door, flatly refused to allow under any circumstances. For a few precious hours, moving to that music in a room absolutely packed with your own people, the whole accumulated weight of the week lifted clean off your shoulders, all at once. You weren't being careful, not for one single minute. You weren't watching your back over your shoulder. You were simply, fully alive, surrounded by your own, and genuinely free. There's a beautiful, important truth tucked quietly inside all of this joy, and it's worth saying out loud plainly. A people living under enormous, constant pressure did not let that pressure steal away their real capacity for delight. They laughed hard and they meant it. They danced gloriously without holding back. They flirted and they loved and they cut loose completely, and they had genuinely wonderful, roof-raising fun, night after Saturday night. And they did every bit of it inside spaces they had built entirely for themselves, precisely because the wider world's own spaces had been closed off to them from the start. The party itself wasn't some kind of distraction from the larger struggle happening all around it. It was, in its own quiet way, part of exactly how the community survived that struggle in the first place. A flat, joyful refusal to let one hard week win the entire person. And then, of course, 12 hours later, almost to the minute, a good many of those very same dancers would be sitting quietly in the pews once again, hair carefully back in place, faces newly composed, ready for the choir to begin. Saturday night and Sunday morning, the two great releases of the working week, holding the whole community steady and upright between them, one supporting the other, week after week after week. From those same crowded rooms and that same restless spirit came the people who would go on to give the community something else it badly needed all along, its heroes. Let's talk properly about heroes, because you genuinely need them, and by this decade, you genuinely have them. When Jackie Robinson steps out onto a major league field, he carries a weight that no batting average could ever hope to fully measure. Every taunt shouted from the stands and swallowed whole without response. Every pitch thrown deliberately at his head. Every single eye in the country fixed on him, watching closely to see whether he'll finally crack under the pressure. He doesn't. Before him, there was Joe Louis, who carried an entire nation's hopes tucked inside a pair of boxing gloves. These men were never simply athletes. They were, in a very real sense, arguments made flesh, living proof, shouted across an entire country that mostly didn't want to hear it. When they won, your whole block won right alongside them. And when they endured quietly, they taught the rest of you exactly how. Start with Jackie Robinson, because what he accomplished reached so far beyond the game of baseball itself. When he broke the sport's color line in 1947 and carried that weight on into the following decade, he had agreed as a condition of the whole arrangement to a nearly impossible personal restraint that he would not fight back. Not against the slurs raining down from the stands, not against opposing pitchers deliberately throwing at his head, not against runners sliding in with their spikes raised on purpose, not even against certain teammates who would have preferred he simply weren't there at all. He had to absorb every bit of it, a steady river of daily cruelty, and answer all of it with nothing but his play on the field. It stands as one of the great feats of pure self-control in American history, performed entirely in public, under a bright spotlight, with an entire race's public reputation deliberately loaded onto his shoulders by a country actively looking for any excuse to say, "I told you so." And he did not break. He played the game brilliantly. He ran the bases like a rumor of the future itself, and he gradually won over even a fair number of people who had come into the season actively rooting against him. Every single game he survived stood as an argument won, decisively. On the biggest public stage, the country had to offer proof, in front of millions of witnesses, that the entire underlying logic of segregation had always been a lie. Your community felt every ounce of that weight right alongside him, and every ounce of that hard-won triumph too. When Jackie succeeded, the success genuinely belonged to the whole block, not to him alone. Before Robinson, there was Joe Louis, the brown bomber, who had carried a remarkably similar burden inside a pair of boxing gloves a decade earlier, and whose legend was still very much alive in living memory throughout the 1950s. When Louis stepped into the ring, entire neighborhoods gathered tightly around their radios, holding their collective breath together. Because his fights were never merely fights. They functioned as something closer to national referendums, especially on the nights he faced a foreign opponent and became, for one evening, the whole country's champion regardless of race. When Louis won, the streets genuinely erupted. People poured directly out of their homes to celebrate together, because his victory belonged to everyone listening. A single shared moment when your community's playing excellence became completely undeniable, and the whole watching world had no choice but to see it land. Here's what these particular heroes really gave the community, though, beyond the individual wins themselves. They handed down a working blueprint for a very specific kind of strength, the discipline required to endure enormous, deliberate provocation without ever being provoked into a response, to answer raw hatred with sheer excellence instead, to keep your own dignity fully intact under conditions specifically engineered to strip it away piece by piece. That was precisely the strength your community was going to need in the years just ahead, when ordinary people would sit quietly at lunch counters and ride buses and march down public streets, absorbing real abuse and steadily refusing to answer it in kind. Jackie Robinson had already shown, right there on a baseball diamond in front of the whole country, exactly what that kind of discipline looked like in practice. And the heroes of the era were never only athletes, either. There were scholars, scientists, writers, singers, and community leaders whose individual achievements punched real holes straight through the country's low expectations, one at a time. Every single one of them was quietly doing double duty, excelling at the actual work itself, while simultaneously carrying the extra invisible weight of representing an entire people, of knowing full well that any stumble would be hung around the whole community's neck, and any genuine triumph would lift the whole community right along with it. They performed, day after day, under a level of pressure their white counterparts in the same fields simply never had to feel at all. So your community held its heroes close, followed their careers fiercely, argued about their performances for hours on end, and drew real strength from their strength. They were living proof, and everybody in every era needs proof of that kind close at hand. And when you wanted to properly talk through last night's ball game or last week's big fight, to argue it out and relive it and break it all the way down to the smallest detail, you already knew exactly where to go for that, the same place you went for practically everything else. The barbershop. Let's step properly into the barbershop, because it amounts to considerably more than simply a place to get a haircut. This is the men's town square, the daily news wire, the informal debate hall, the neighborhood's unofficial therapist's office, all of it bundled neatly together for the modest price of a trim. Here, the conversation runs freely from baseball to the boss down at the plant, to the entire current state of the race in America, and every single man in the room has got a firm opinion he's fully prepared to defend at length. The barber himself knows everyone in the neighborhood and everything currently happening to them, keeps whatever confidences genuinely need keeping, and spreads whatever news genuinely needs spreading, all while ruling the entire room with a steady straight razor in one hand and a running commentary flowing from his mouth the whole time. Whole personal philosophies get quietly worked out in that particular chair over the years. Whole lasting friendships get built there, too. It's one of the very few genuinely free rooms you'll stand in all week long. Understand, first, that the barbershop, much like the church, stood as a space your community owned entirely outright, on its own terms. No white employer stood watching the door. No color line ran anywhere through the middle of the room. Inside those particular walls, a black man could speak his complete, unguarded mind at full volume on absolutely any subject he pleased, with no real need to carefully manage his expression or measure his words the way the outside world demanded of him for the rest of the week without exception. That freedom of speech, genuine, unguarded, entirely unwatched by outside eyes, was rare and precious, and it turned the barbershop into something close to sacred, in its own rowdy, unpretentious way. So the talk flowed freely, and the talk was, in its own way, everything. Sports, naturally, came up constantly, last night's game relitigated pitch by pitch, inning by inning. Jackie's latest performance and Joe Louis' old fights defended and debated in equal measure, reputations built up and torn back down again entirely over the steady buzz of the electric clippers. Politics came up just as often, along with the entire condition of the community more broadly, argued over with a real passion and sharpness you rarely encountered anywhere else in daily life. Somebody in the room always had a fresh theory. Somebody else always firmly disagreed with it. And the disagreeing itself was genuinely half the fun of the whole afternoon. A good, spirited barbershop argument functioned as a form of entertainment in its own right, a proper sport, conducted with real wit and real heat, and generally no lasting hard feelings once the haircut itself was finally finished. The barber himself cut a figure of genuine standing in the community. He was a business owner in his own right, fully independent, beholden to no white employer whatsoever, which alone made him a man of real consequence around the neighborhood. But beyond that, he served as the community's unofficial keeper of information. Everybody passed through his chair sooner or later, and everybody, once seated, tended to talk freely. Which meant the barber generally knew who was getting married soon, who was quietly struggling, who had just landed steady work, who was sick, who was currently up to what mischief around the neighborhood. He held the confidences that genuinely needed holding close, and he spread the particular pieces of news that genuinely needed spreading, all while wielding a straight razor with the calm, practiced authority of a man who had never once, in his whole career, nicked anybody who didn't have it coming. There was real mentoring happening in that room, too, though nobody in the chair would ever have thought to call it that out loud. The young man getting his hair cut that particular Saturday was also, without quite realizing it, receiving a kind of education, listening closely as the older men in the room argued and reminisced and quietly laid down hard-won wisdom, absorbing exactly how a grown black man was expected to carry himself out in the world, learning the community's shared history and its particular humor and its hard-earned lessons, all folded neatly into the middle of an entirely ordinary Saturday afternoon. Whole informal codes of manhood got quietly passed down, generation to generation, somewhere between the buzzing clippers and the wall mirror. And it was, above everything else, a genuine place of comfort. A man who couldn't afford to show any real weakness anywhere else all week long could finally ease up a little in that chair, get gently teased by his friends, and feel genuinely welcomed, sitting among people who actually knew him and saw him fully, in a week otherwise full of rooms where he constantly had to be careful about every word and every gesture. That mattered considerably more in the end than any haircut ever really could on its own. It was maintenance for a man's spirit every bit as much as it was maintenance for his hairline, the barber shop and the beauty shop, the church and the club. These stood as the community's free spaces, the rooms your people built for themselves, specifically, where the outside world's rules simply couldn't reach. And it was in exactly these kinds of rooms, over exactly these kinds of unguarded conversations, that a whole people slowly, and then quite suddenly all at once, talked itself toward the historic decision to change absolutely everything. But before we arrive at that particular turning point, there's still the matter of how your community even came to know what was actually happening out in the wider world. The news the mainstream papers simply wouldn't bother to print. For that, you turn to a press entirely your own. How does real news actually travel through your world then? Not through the mainstream papers that ignore your community entirely, or mention it only briefly in the crime column when something goes badly wrong. It travels instead through your own dedicated press. The Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, a copy of Jet magazine folded neatly and tucked into a coat pocket, a fresh issue of Ebony sitting proudly out on the coffee table for guests to see. Newspapers and magazines that faithfully cover your weddings, your churches, your everyday triumphs and your injustices, when quite literally nobody else in the country will bother to. The Defender, specifically, had helped call an entire generation north during the Great Migration in years past. These are the pages where a widely scattered people keep close track of themselves, celebrate themselves properly, and warn one another of danger. In a country that consistently looks away, the black press flatly refuses to blink, week after week. Start with the actual problem the black press existed to solve in the first place. Open up any mainstream white newspaper of this particular era and go looking for yourself inside its pages, and you would find almost nothing at all. And on the rare occasion you did appear in print, it was usually somewhere in the crime pages, named and publicly shamed, or else not mentioned anywhere in the paper at all. Your weddings went unannounced. Your graduates went uncelebrated in print. Your churches, your local businesses, your genuine achievements, even your own dead, all of it fell steadily through the cracks of a mainstream press that simply never considered your community worth much of its ink. So your community built a press of its own instead, and it turned out to be genuinely mighty. The Chicago Defender stood as a real powerhouse, read faithfully all across the entire country, and it had done something quite extraordinary during the years of the Great Migration. It actively urged Southern black families to head north, printing out the concrete case for a considerably better life, running train schedules and current job listings right alongside the editorials, painting a vivid picture of exactly what freedom might genuinely look like once you crossed above the old color line. Pullman porters and other traveling workers smuggled copies of the paper down south, into places where it was sometimes outright banned, or genuinely dangerous simply to be caught holding one, and passed those copies quietly from hand to hand. A newspaper that helped, in its own way, move a full 1,000,000 people northward is not a small achievement by any reasonable measure. That's a paper that fundamentally changed the map of the country. The Pittsburgh Courier stood as another genuine giant of the era, and during the recent war years, it had championed the Double V campaign, victory abroad against fascism overseas, and victory at home against homegrown racism. A piece of framing so sharp and so precise it managed to name the entire underlying contradiction of the country in just 2 crisp letters. These papers never merely reported on the community's daily life from a comfortable distance. They actively argued its cause, sharpened its collective thinking, and gave a widely scattered, geographically divided people a genuine shared conversation to take part in together, week after week. Then came the glossy magazines that sat proudly out on so many living room coffee tables. Ebony, glossy, and unapologetically proud, put black success, black beauty, and black achievement on full, confident display for anyone to see. A monthly refusal, in effect, of the country's persistent insistence that your lives were somehow small or unremarkable. And yet, the little pocket-sized digest that fit easily into a coat pocket or a handbag went absolutely everywhere and got read faithfully cover to cover, passed hand to hand around the neighborhood, until the pages themselves quite literally fell apart from use. Jet functioned as the genuine pulse of Black America, the place you turned to find out what was really happening, week after week, beneath the surface of the official story. And that particular role, telling the plain truth the mainstream press simply wouldn't touch, is exactly what made the black press so genuinely powerful in the years still to come. When something truly terrible happened that the white papers would clearly rather bury quietly, the black press printed the story plainly, in full, and made certain the whole community actually saw it. It could take a single local horror and transform it into a genuine national reckoning. It could take a story the rest of the country badly wanted to simply ignore and turn it into something no longer possible to look away from. That particular power was about to matter more than anyone yet fully realized, because the press wasn't merely recording your community's daily life from the sidelines. It was steadily becoming one of the movement's great tools in its own right. But before the press, there was another right entirely, one the country had promised loudly on paper and then blocked at every possible turn in practice. The single most basic tool of self-defense any people could ever hope to have, and not coincidentally, the one most fiercely and systematically denied. Let's talk properly about voting, that particular thing schoolchildren are taught to call the very bedrock of the entire country. On paper, it is plainly your right, guaranteed by the Constitution itself. In actual practice, especially throughout the South, there sits an entire obstacle course, deliberately built for the sole purpose of making absolutely certain you never once reach the ballot box. A poll tax you simply cannot spare from an already thin household budget. a literacy test featuring questions no living soul could reasonably be expected to answer correctly. Guess precisely the number of bubbles in a bar of soap. Recite the entire state constitution from memory, word for word, on demand. A registrar sitting behind the desk who has already decided, well before you finish your first sentence, to fail you on principle alone. And the rules themselves bend and shift the very instant you happen to get close to actually succeeding. It amounts, in the end, to democracy fitted out with a velvet rope and a well-paid bouncer standing guard, specifically to keep you out. Understand clearly what the vote actually represented in practice, and you begin to understand exactly why the system fought so hard, for so long, to deny it to you. The ballot itself meant real power, the power to elect a local sheriff who wouldn't actively terrorize your neighborhood, a judge who might actually hear your case with something resembling fairness, elected officials who would, at last, have to answer directly to your community's interests rather than simply ignoring them. Every single indignity we've walked through together tonight, every painted sign, every closed door, every rigged financial wall, was ultimately held firmly in place by elected people your community had no real say whatsoever in choosing. The vote functioned as the master key to the entire arrangement, which is precisely why the system bolted that particular door shut and posted an armed guard directly in front of it. Take the poll tax first, a fee you were required to pay out of pocket purely for the privilege of casting a ballot. And in a fair number of places, you had to pay that same tax retroactively for every single year you'd previously missed, all at once in a lump sum, before you'd even be permitted to register for the current election. For families already scraping by from week to week, that amounted to an entire wall built plainly out of money. A right you were required to purchase outright is, by definition, a right reserved specifically for whoever can actually afford it, which was, quite deliberately, rather the entire point of the exercise. Then came the literacy test, which is precisely where the cruelty of the whole system turned genuinely inventive. In theory, on paper, you simply had to demonstrate that you could read and reasonably understand the law. In actual practice, the registrar sitting behind the desk could hand you any passage of the dense state constitution he happened to choose that morning. A passage so deliberately convoluted that a practicing lawyer might reasonably squint at it for several minutes, and then judge your resulting answer however he personally pleased, with zero accountability to anyone. Some tests in certain counties reached a level of pure, deliberate absurdity, questions with genuinely no correct answer at all, like being asked to guess precisely how many jelly beans filled a large glass jar sitting on the counter. There was no passing score you could realistically study toward, because the actual score was whatever the man sitting behind that desk personally decided it should be that particular morning, and that very same man would wave a white applicant through with a friendly smile and a nod. No test administered at all, not even as a formality. That arbitrary discretion was the true engine driving the whole apparatus, total, unchecked discretion, placed directly in the hands of people fully committed to keeping you out of the voting booth by any means necessary. The registrar could conveniently lose your completed paperwork. He could close the office early, right as you walked up. He could tell you politely to simply come back another day, and then repeat that same excuse indefinitely. He could fail you outright for a single misplaced comma on the application. And if somehow, against considerable odds, you managed to clear every single hurdle placed in front of you, there might well be a further threat waiting quietly on the other side. Your name published openly in the local paper, your employer directly informed, your line of credit abruptly cut off without explanation, or worse still. Registering to vote could genuinely cost you your job or your basic safety, and everybody in town understood that risk perfectly well, which meant the deterrent itself did most of the system's real work long before you ever set foot inside the actual courthouse. The end result was a democracy that proudly called itself a democracy on the world stage, while systematically silencing millions of its own citizens back home. In county after county where black residents actually made up the clear majority of the local population, they nonetheless held almost none of the real political power, because that velvet rope held firm, year after year, election after election. It amounted to genuine hypocrisy on a truly national scale, a country actively lecturing the rest of the world about the virtues of freedom, while a bouncer stationed at the courthouse door quietly turned away anyone whose hand on the sign-in sheet happened to be the wrong color. But your community understood exactly what that locked door was actually worth, precisely because they had been locked out of it so deliberately and for so long. The fight for the ballot would go on to become one of the central, defining battles of the years immediately ahead, ordinary people risking absolutely everything, up to and including their own lives, simply to register, simply to cast a single vote. They understood, without needing to be told twice, that the master key was genuinely worth dying for if it came to that. And they understood, just as clearly, exactly what waited on the other side of directly challenging the system, because the whole arrangement was, in the end, ultimately enforced by an institution you had to watch closely every single hour of every single day. Now we arrive at the part of the day you keep one careful eye on at all times, without ever fully relaxing, the law itself. In your world, a police officer is not automatically someone you run toward for help in a moment of trouble. Justice itself can hinge entirely on who precisely you happen to be and on who precisely is doing the accusing. So you teach yourself from a young age the careful unwritten rules of any encounter with authority. Hands kept visible at all times, voice kept level and calm. Sir, attached politely to the end of every single sentence, regardless of how you're actually being spoken to in return. Swallow the injustice whole without visible reaction and live to see tomorrow morning. A courtroom might weigh your sworn word as worth considerably less than another man's word, before you've even had the chance to say a single sentence in your own defense. This is heavy ground to walk across together, and it genuinely deserves to be walked slowly and carefully. So we will. Let's be entirely plain about the fundamental inversion sitting at the very heart of all this. The law is supposed to be the thing that protects you, first and foremost, above all else. In your world, all too often, the law was instead the very thing you needed active protection from. A given police officer might turn out to be genuinely fair-minded, or he might not be, and you had no reliable way of knowing in advance which one you were dealing with, and essentially no real recourse afterward if he wasn't. So the safest working assumption, learned early and reinforced constantly, was caution above all else. Treat every single encounter with authority as potentially dangerous, because the cost of guessing wrong was simply too high, and the available protection, if things went badly, was far too thin to rely on. Out of that harsh daily reality grew an entire grim curriculum, quietly taught inside every black household, covering exactly how to survive any contact with authority intact. Keep your hands where they can plainly be seen at all times. Keep your voice low, calm, and perfectly even no matter the provocation. Answer respectfully with sir and ma'am, regardless of how the badge in front of you happens to be speaking to you in that moment. Don't argue back, however clearly you're in the right. Don't bother explaining your side of the situation. Don't assert a legal right you technically and genuinely hold, because simply being correct offered no real defense, and asserting it plainly could, in practice, make an already dangerous situation considerably worse. Absorb the insult. Absorb the injustice, whatever it happens to be that day. And above everything else, get home safely to your family. The actual goal of any such encounter was never justice in the abstract. The goal, plainly and simply, was survival. Everybody involved fully understood that difference, without it ever needing to be spelled out loud. Then there was the courtroom itself, where the scales of justice had frequently already been weighted well before you ever walked through the door. An all-white jury seated in the box, a white judge presiding from the bench. Lawyers, bailiffs, the entire surrounding apparatus of the court, arranged in such a way that a black defendant faced a system containing not a single person who looked like him, or who seemed genuinely inclined to see his side of things fairly. Your sworn word, in any given dispute against a white person's word, could simply be treated as effectively worthless by default, not because of any actual evidence weighed carefully on the merits, but purely because of the color of the mouth the words happen to be coming from. Justice is supposed to wear a blindfold. This particular version of justice peaked every single time, without fail, and ruled accordingly. The resulting consequences ran in both directions at once, and both directions proved genuinely brutal in practice. A black person accused of any crime, whether guilty or entirely innocent, faced punishment that was, on average, considerably harsher and considerably swifter than a white person would face for that exact same act. And a white person who committed a genuine crime against a black victim frequently faced nothing at all in return: no arrest made, no formal charges filed, no jury in the county willing to actually convict. The system, in effect, punished you severely at every turn and protected you almost not at all. It amounted to justice with the wiring quietly reversed, heavy weight pressing down on one side of the scale, and almost nothing at all sitting on the other. I've said already that this particular ground is heavy, and it genuinely is. So let me be careful here about exactly what I am claiming, and equally careful about what I am not claiming. I am not saying that every single officer who ever wore a badge in this era was personally cruel, or that every courtroom in the country amounted to nothing but a sham. People on the whole are simply people, and there were real exceptions here and there, decent individuals doing their honest best inside a structure that was, at its foundation, built crooked. But the underlying structure itself was built that way quite deliberately, and the scattered exceptions, however genuine, couldn't straighten it out on their own. The real point here isn't to indict every single person who ever carried a badge. The real point is that a black family, as a matter of basic survival, simply could not count on the law to protect them, and had to organize their entire daily conduct around that difficult, ever-present fact. This is the weight your community carried quietly underneath absolutely everything else discussed tonight. The hard knowledge that the ultimate governing authority in the land could not reliably be trusted to protect you, and might, under the wrong circumstances, actively harm you instead. It's the fear running quietly beneath the bus ride, beneath the shopping trip downtown, beneath the long drive at dusk with one eye fixed on the horizon. And in the summer of 1955, that particular fear stopped being a distant abstraction altogether, and instead took the specific, devastating form of a 14-year-old boy. His name has to be spoken tonight, and it has to be spoken with real care. There's a name we have to say tonight gently and with real care: Emmett Till. In the summer of 1955, a 14-year-old boy from Chicago traveled south to visit family in Mississippi, and he never made it back home. His mother, in the aftermath, made a decision of almost unimaginable courage. She opened the casket and let the entire country see, with its own eyes, exactly what had been done to her child. Jet magazine carried the photographs, and something in the country's conscience cracked open that had never fully cracked before. This is not a story for lightness, and I won't reach for any tonight. It's a story meant only for remembering carefully and completely. His name became, for an entire rising generation, the reason enough was finally, truly enough. Let me tell it simply, because it deserves no unnecessary ornament laid over the top of it. Emmett Till was a boy of 14, raised in Chicago, sent south that particular summer to visit relatives in the Mississippi Delta, the way children have always been sent off to spend a summer with extended family. He was, by upbringing, a northern kid, not yet fully fluent in the suffocating set of unwritten rules a black child was expected to live by without exception in rural Mississippi. An accusation was made against him, involving an encounter with a white woman at a small country store, the precise details of which have been disputed, and in later years partly recanted, by the woman herself. Whatever exactly was said or wasn't said in that store, the plain truth remains that a child was accused of stepping over an invisible line that carried a lethal penalty in that particular county. For that alone, in the darkness of night, he was taken from the home where he was staying as a guest, and he was murdered brutally by grown men who had decided among themselves that this was an acceptable punishment for a 14-year-old. His body was recovered from a nearby river several days later. He was 14 years old. I'm going to leave the specific details there, out of real respect, because the full horror of what happened doesn't need me to dwell on it further tonight for you to feel its complete weight settling in. A boy went south to visit his cousins for the summer, and he was killed for it. That single sentence on its own should be enough to stop the breath in anyone's chest, however many times you've heard it before. And then his mother, Emmett Till, did something that would go on to change the entire course of the country. When her son's body was finally returned home to Chicago, she made a decision requiring almost unimaginable inner strength. She refused to quietly hide what had been done to him. She insisted on an open casket at the funeral, specifically so that everyone who came could see, with their own eyes, exactly what those men had done to her boy. "Let the people see," she said in effect, again and again to anyone who questioned the decision. She took her own private, unbearable grief and transformed it, deliberately, into a public act of witness for the whole country to reckon with. And in doing so, she flatly refused to let her son's murder be treated as quiet, or deniable, or quickly forgotten by a country eager to move past it. Jet magazine, that same small, black-owned digest we spoke of earlier tonight, the one that traveled absolutely everywhere and got passed hand to hand until the pages fell apart, published the photographs in full, and the country, for the first time, genuinely could not look away any longer. What had remained, for much of white America, a distant abstraction, a vague rumor, a story easy enough to quietly disbelieve or set aside, was now an actual photograph of a grieving mother's murdered child, starring out plainly from the pages of a magazine circulating hand to hand across the entire nation. The abstraction suddenly had a face. It had a name, and that name belonged to a boy of 14. The men later charged with the murder stood trial before an all-white jury in Mississippi. You'll remember what we discussed earlier tonight about courtrooms of this era. They were acquitted in barely more than an hour of deliberation, and then, under the protections of double jeopardy, could never be tried again for the same crime under any circumstances. Sometime later, protected from further prosecution, they openly admitted to the killing in exchange for a magazine payment, describing it in their own words. The system had failed that boy completely, in plain view, for the entire country to witness. And that very public failure, laid bare for anyone willing to look, did something the killers themselves never intended or foresaw. It lit a fire that would not go back out, because an entire generation of young black Americans saw those photographs, read that verdict, and quietly, privately, made an unshakable decision of their own. That, for many of them, was the exact moment enough finally became enough. Emmett Till was almost precisely the same age as the students who would, within just a few short years, be sitting calmly at segregated lunch counters and marching together in the streets. They carried his memory into that fight like a solemn, private vow. His mother's extraordinary courage had turned an unspeakable personal loss into a public summons, and the whole country, whether it wanted to or not, would eventually be forced to answer it. We say his name gently tonight, and we say it clearly so that it is never quietly forgotten. And standing behind his mother's courage that terrible summer stood a long, unbroken line of women who had already been quietly holding this entire community together for generations before her. Let's talk properly about the women who carry this whole world on their backs, and who so rarely receive the full credit they've earned for it. You work an entire day inside someone else's house, and then you walk into your own home and simply start the whole shift over again from scratch. You hold the family together through every hardship. You keep the church running smoothly week after week. You stretch a single dollar until it practically hollers in protest, and you raise children to be both genuinely proud and genuinely safe, in a country that seems determined to quietly threaten both qualities at once. You're expected somehow to be strong without ever being fully seen, dignified in the face of open insult, gentle at the end of a day that offered you no gentleness whatsoever in return. The backbone of this entire community has always, largely, been a woman's backbone, and it has been carrying considerably more than its fair share of the weight for a very long time now. Consider the double shift first, because it defined so many women's entire lives during this decade. She rose long before dawn and rode clear across town to labor inside a white family's home, cooking, cleaning, minding children who weren't her own, exactly as we discussed earlier tonight. Then she rode home again, bone-tired, and began the entire process over, this time for her own household, her own meals still needing to be cooked, her own floors still needing to be scrubbed, her own children still needing raising, her own home still needing to be held together against considerable odds. 2 full working days packed neatly into one single day, repeated for years on end without complaint. And that second shift, the one waiting for her at home, she performed purely out of love, often with almost nothing left in the tank by that point except love itself, which somehow, against all reasonable expectation, proved to be enough to sustain an entire household. Now look closely at just how much of the community's overall life actually ran on women's steady labor and sheer force of will. The church, that great anchoring institution we spoke of earlier, who filled the pews faithfully every single Sunday, ran the various auxiliary boards, cooked the funeral dinners for grieving families, taught the Sunday school lessons, raised the necessary money, and kept the whole operation breathing steadily between one Sunday and the next. The women, overwhelmingly. The mutual aid networks, the quiet care extended to the sick, the constant watchful looking after of the block's collective children, the quiet knowledge of precisely who in the neighborhood needed help this particular week, and the quiet, unannounced delivery of exactly that help. The women, again, overwhelmingly. So much of what genuinely held this community together, day after day, was women's labor, largely uncredited in any formal sense, and yet absolutely essential to everything else functioning at all. She was, on top of everything else, a genuine master of the impossible arithmetic involved in stretching a painfully thin paycheck across a household's very real needs. She could stretch a small amount of money across a large amount of genuine need through nothing but sheer ingenuity, remaking old clothes into new ones, feeding an entire family from what looked, at first glance, like scraps and pure genius combined. Making do, and somehow, at the same time, making it genuinely beautiful for her family. The economic walls we discussed earlier tonight pressed hardest, in practice, right here, inside the household budget. And it was very often a woman's particular resourcefulness that kept the whole family properly fed, decently clothed, and standing upright regardless of what the wider economy had denied them. She turned plain scarcity into real sufficiency, over and over again, week after week, and somehow made the whole difficult process look effortless to anyone watching from outside. Hardest of all, by any honest measure, was the raising of children inside a world so plainly rigged against them from the start, a subject that deserves, and will shortly receive, its own dedicated moment tonight. But know, going in, that this particular weight landed heaviest of all on the mothers themselves. The demanding job of building proud, whole, confident children who also, simultaneously, needed to know exactly how to be careful enough to actually survive to adulthood. Pride and caution, both poured into a single child by a woman who had to be, at once, both genuinely fierce and genuinely tender, sometimes within the very same minute, sometimes over the very same sentence. And through absolutely all of it, she was expected, as a matter of course, to carry herself with a dignity the wider world consistently refused to return to her in kind. Insulted openly, she kept her composure intact. Exhausted down to her bones, she kept the atmosphere at home gentle for her family's sake. Largely unseen and uncredited by the wider society, she kept the entire household quietly running without fail. The strength demanded of black women throughout this era was, by any fair measure, genuinely staggering, and it remained largely invisible to the wider world, which generally preferred, for its own comfort, not to look too closely in the first place. But it was never invisible to the community itself, and it should not remain invisible to us tonight either. So when we finally arrive, later tonight, at the movement itself, when we talk about who actually organized the mass meetings, who ran the informal communication networks, who sustained the long boycott month after difficult month, who did all the unglamorous daily work that made the entire fight even possible in the first place, remember, plainly, that a great deal of that essential backbone was, once again, a woman's backbone. Rosa Parks did not simply appear out of nowhere on that bus in December of 1955. She stood, quite literally, on the shoulders of generations of women who had already been quietly holding this entire world together, year after year, decade after decade. And the single most demanding thing many of those women ever did was the thing they did quietly, at their own kitchen table, with their own children sitting right there. A conversation no parent anywhere should ever have to have with a child they love. Now let's talk properly about the children themselves, and about the genuinely impossible thing you have to somehow teach them, sooner or later, without ever quite finding the right words for it. On the one hand, you want your children to run freely, to laugh without restraint, to genuinely believe the whole world is theirs for the taking. And childhood, remarkably, always finds a way to happen regardless of circumstances, with stickball played in the street, penny candy from the corner store, and long summer nights that seem to stretch on forever. On the other hand, you eventually have to sit them down for the talk that no parent anywhere on earth should ever be forced to give a child: how to be careful, how to make yourself deliberately small in the wrong company, how to actually get home safely at the end of the day. You're raising them to be proud and cautious in the very same breath, at the very same time. It is, without exaggeration, the hardest arithmetic there is to work out as a parent. First, let's properly honor the childhood itself, because it was genuinely real, and it was genuinely rich in its own way. Black children throughout the 1950s played very much the way all children everywhere have always played. Stickball and stoopball out in the street. Jump rope games with rhymes handed down through the neighborhood like small family heirlooms. Games of hide and seek that ran on until the streetlights finally clicked on overhead and somebody's mother started hollering names out into the gathering dark. Penny candy purchased carefully from the corner store. Comic books traded and retraded endlessly among friends. Summers that stretched out seemingly forever, thick with heat and freedom, and the particular kind of magic that comes from being young among your own people, on your own familiar block, where you were genuinely safe, genuinely known, and genuinely loved by everyone around you. That particular safety, contained within your own block, was precious precisely because it ended sharply at the very edge of it. Within the community itself, a child really could simply be a child, watched over collectively by an entire neighborhood full of adults, gently corrected by any grown-up who happened to notice something amiss, folded securely into a whole web of shared care extending well beyond a single household. The real trouble began, as it always eventually did, the moment a child had to leave those familiar blocks behind and step out into the wider world, where the rules abruptly changed, and the stakes turned genuinely, sometimes fatally, serious. And so came the talk. This particular conversation stood as the terrible, unavoidable duty of every single black parent, and there was simply no way around having it eventually. At some point, you had to sit your own child down and carefully teach them the practical survival rules of a world that could turn openly hostile without much warning. How to behave carefully around white strangers. How to speak respectfully and carefully to a police officer, regardless of the circumstances. Which particular lines could never, under any circumstances, be crossed. How to make yourself appear small and entirely unthreatening, in a situation that could turn genuinely dangerous within a matter of seconds. You had to explain somehow, to a child who had done absolutely nothing wrong, that the wider world would nonetheless treat them as automatically suspect simply for existing in public, and that their own survival could very well depend on how carefully they managed to navigate that basic unfairness. Imagine, for a moment, the particular cruelty built into your own position as a parent in that conversation. You want, more than practically anything else in the world, to tell your child plainly that they are wonderful exactly as they are, that the whole world genuinely belongs to them, that they can grow up to become absolutely anything they choose to be. And a child genuinely needs to believe that fully and completely in order to grow up whole and unbroken. But you also, at the very same time, have to teach that same child real fear, specific, concrete, actionable fear, because that particular fear might very well be the thing that keeps them alive one day. Pride placed carefully in one hand, caution placed just as carefully in the other, and somehow you have to hand your child both of them at once, without letting either one crush or overwhelm the other entirely. Too little caution, and the wider world might genuinely hurt your child. Too much caution, and that same world might quietly break their spirit long before they ever get a real chance to use it fully. That delicate balance, proud but appropriately careful, genuinely confident but appropriately wary, taught firmly to hold their head high while also knowing precisely when to lower it at exactly the right moment, was the tightrope every single black child of this era was raised to walk, and the tightrope every single black parent was simultaneously tasked with teaching, however imperfectly. Emmett Till's story, so painfully fresh in this particular decade, made the real stakes of that lesson horrifyingly, unmistakably clear to every mother and father across the entire country. The talk was never merely abstract caution, offered as a formality. It was, quite literally, a matter of a child actually making it back home alive at the end of the day. And yet, here is the genuine wonder buried inside all of it. The children, by and large, grew up proud regardless of everything stacked against them. The love, in the end, proved bigger than the fear ever was. The community poured so much accumulated pride and belonging and inner strength into its young people that they came up whole and strong despite absolutely everything working against them, fully ready, when their particular moment finally arrived, to walk directly into real danger with their heads held high and steady. A great many of those very children would go on to be exactly the ones sitting in at lunch counters and marching in the streets within just a few short years. Their parents' impossible daily arithmetic, worked out patiently at countless kitchen tables, had produced precisely the generation the coming fight would actually need when the moment came. But raising them at all was only ever possible because the community had learned, long before this decade began, to lean hard on one another for practically everything. Starting with the most basic need of all, the one the wider world was all too happy to leave you entirely without. Let's hope for a moment that you don't happen to fall seriously ill, because getting sick in your America turns out to be its own complicated ordeal entirely. A great many hospitals simply won't admit you through the front door at all, or else they'll shunt you quietly off to a segregated basement ward, fitted out with the fewest available beds and the oldest, most outdated equipment on the premises. An ambulance might drive right past the nearest hospital entirely, in order to reach the one facility further away that will actually agree to treat you, so the community, once again, grows its own alternative. Black doctors and nurses, trained against every conceivable barrier the country could invent to stop them. Small clinics run largely on faith and personal sacrifice. Home remedies passed carefully down like treasured family heirlooms. Falling seriously ill in your America means depending, in the end, almost entirely on your own people, because the wider system built specifically to heal, it turns out, was never actually built with the intention of healing everyone equally. Start with the genuine emergency, because that's precisely where the underlying cruelty of the system cut sharpest. Imagine a real crisis unfolding, a serious accident, a sudden medical collapse, and the nearest hospital simply refuses to take you in, purely because of your race. So the ambulance, assuming one actually arrives at all, drives directly past that closest possible care, in order to reach a hospital clear across town that will actually agree to admit black patients. Those extra miles, covered at a critical moment, could very easily mean the difference between living and dying. And the system had that particular delay built directly into the map itself, as a matter of standard, accepted practice. People died because of exactly that kind of delay. It was not a rare occurrence, and it was certainly not any kind of accident. And if you were admitted at all, you were very often admitted only to the margins of the building. A segregated ward, frequently located down in the basement, fitted out with the fewest available beds, the oldest equipment on hand, the least of practically everything a patient might actually need. Separate, once again, and unequal once again, only this time in the one place where that particular inequality could genuinely kill you outright. The quality care that flowed freely and immediately to white patients elsewhere in the very same building was carefully rationed out to you instead, under worse conditions, at the very back of the line, precisely during your hour of greatest medical need. So your community did exactly what it had already learned to do in response to every other closed door encountered throughout this long day. It built its own way in from scratch. Black doctors and nurses trained against genuinely staggering obstacles, barred outright from a great many medical schools, kept firmly out of a great many hospitals and professional medical societies, forced to fight hard for every single credential. A white physician of equal skill was simply handed as a matter of routine. And they did it anyway in real numbers, training one another through their own dedicated institutions, producing skilled, deeply dedicated healers who then came home to serve faithfully the very community that had raised them up in the first place. The black physician, much like the local minister and the local undertaker, stood as a genuine community pillar, respected, essential to daily life, and stretched impossibly thin across far too many patients for far too few hours in any given day. There were black-run hospitals and clinics as well, built and funded directly by the community itself, often operating on little more than a shoestring budget and a great deal of faith, providing exactly the care the wider medical system flatly refused to offer. They ran on real sacrifice, on doctors and nurses working well past any reasonable limit of endurance, on modest donations from people who genuinely had very little extra to give in the first place, on the church collection plate, and the mutual aid society reaching out once again to help cover a pressing need the wider country had simply abandoned. These small institutions saved countless lives over the years, and they existed for exactly one clear reason: because your community flatly refused to simply accept being left behind to suffer alone. And then there was the home front itself, the deep, accumulated well of folk medicine and home remedies passed carefully down through the generations, from mother to daughter, from grandmother to grandchild, season after season. When the hospital was genuinely out of reach, or simply out of the question entirely, families relied instead on their own accumulated wisdom, the home remedies, the careful poultices, the practical knowledge of exactly what to do when there was truly nobody else around to do it for you. Some of that knowledge amounted to old superstition, admittedly, and a good deal of it amounted to genuine, hard-earned, practical medical knowledge, tested and refined over generations. But all of it, in the end, traced back to the very same underlying source: a people who had been forced, by circumstance, to learn how to care properly for their own, because nobody else out there could reliably be counted on to do it for them. There's a bitter irony sitting quietly at the center of all this that shouldn't be missed. Black hands very often helped build, staff, and keep running the very same medical system that so often turned black patients away at the front door. Black orderlies, cooks, and support staff kept entire hospitals functioning smoothly day after day. Hospitals that wouldn't reliably give those very same workers a proper hospital bed of their own if they fell ill. You helped hold up an entire house that wouldn't let you in through its own front door. And still, through your own doctors and nurses and healers and grandmothers working quietly at kitchen tables, your community somehow kept itself alive and functioning, which points, in the end, toward the single deepest truth running underneath this entire long day. The one thing that made real survival possible at all, from sunrise straight through to sunset. Let's talk, finally, about exactly how you survive all of it, taken together as a whole. Because the honest answer was never grim endurance alone, carried in isolation. The honest answer always was each other. When a family comes up genuinely short one particular month, the neighbors quietly fill the gap without being asked twice. When someone in the community passes away, the burial society has the arrangements fully handled, and the kitchens up and down the block fill steadily with food before the tears have even properly dried. Children get raised, collectively, by a whole street's worth of watchful eyes. There's a rent party thrown together quickly whenever the landlord starts looming too close. A covered plate of food quietly sent over when somebody falls sick. A ride offered without a second thought when somebody has no working car of their own. A society that had deliberately locked you out from the outside forced your community to build a considerably warmer one on the inside instead. And in 1,000 small, stubborn, everyday ways, you genuinely did exactly that. Here, in the end, is the central truth running underneath this entire story we've walked through together tonight. The one thing sitting quietly beneath everything else we've discussed. Nobody in your community ever faced any of this entirely alone. The wider country had drawn a hard wall directly around your people. And inside that wall, denied any real support from the outside world, your community built a web of mutual care so strong and so finely woven that it caught nearly everyone who happened to fall. Solidarity in your world was never simply a slogan printed somewhere. It was genuine infrastructure. It was, quite simply, how you lived your entire life, day in and day out. Watch it work close up when a family came up short one month. A father lost his steady job unexpectedly. A mother fell seriously ill without warning. A sudden crisis hit the household, and the neighbors simply closed in tightly around that gap, almost automatically. A little money passed quietly from hand to hand, no ceremony attached to it, no shame involved on either side. Food appeared on the doorstep without needing to be requested. Somebody quietly watched the children for a few days. Somebody happened to know of available work nearby. The help arrived quickly, and it arrived without ever really needing to be formally asked for, because everyone involved understood the unspoken deal perfectly well. Today, it happens to be your family that's struggling. Tomorrow, it might just as easily be mine. Either we hold each other up together, or, quite plainly, none of us make it through at all. That shared understanding formed the true bedrock underneath the entire community's daily life. Watch it work again when someone in the neighborhood died, the moment, arguably, of the very greatest need. The burial society, funded faithfully a little at a time by practically everybody in the neighborhood, made absolutely certain the dead could be buried with genuine dignity intact, regardless of how poor the grieving family happened to be. And the wider community poured in steadily around that grieving family in the difficult days that followed. The kitchens filled up fast. Food arrived by the armload from houses up and down the block. The house itself filled with people who came simply to sit quietly, to cook, to clean, to simply be present, so that nobody in that family grieved entirely alone, and nobody buried their own dead in shame or in isolation. In a community that faced this much loss on a fairly regular basis, this particular care for the dead and for the grieving stood as one of its most sacred, most reliably honored functions. Watch it work, too, in the collective raising of the community's children. A child growing up on that particular block was never really raised by just two parents working alone. A child, in practice, was raised by the entire street together. Any adult on that block could correct you when you stepped out of line, could feed you a meal if you turned up hungry, could look out for you generally, could report your misbehavior straight back to your own mother without a second thought, and a dozen watchful adult eyes tracked every single child up and down that street, all day long, which meant every single child was held securely inside a web of care considerably wider than any one household alone could ever hope to provide on its own. It genuinely did take a village, in the most literal sense, and your community stood as living proof of exactly that old phrase, long before the phrase itself ever became fashionable or widely repeated elsewhere. And watch, finally, the sheer creative inventiveness behind all of this mutual aid. The rent party that quietly turned one night of genuine fun into an entire apartment saved from eviction. The covered plate of food carried carefully down the block to a family dealing with sudden sickness. The ride offered without hesitation to a neighbor who had no working car of their own. The informal savings clubs where neighbors pooled their money together each month and took turns drawing out the full amount when their particular turn finally came around. The endless, quiet exchange of favors and food and spare time that kept practically everyone afloat, week after difficult week. None of it, taken individually, was especially grand or dramatic. All of it, taken together over years, was remarkably constant and reliable. It amounted to an entire economy of kindness, running quietly underneath the official cash economy, doing precisely the work the wider, crueler world outside had flatly refused to do on its own. There's a hard truth folded carefully inside this genuinely beautiful one, the very same one we encountered together on your own block, right at the very start of this long day. This magnificent, carefully built web of mutual care existed, in the end, because it absolutely had to exist. Because a wider society had deliberately cut your community off from its normal channels of support and left it, quite intentionally, to fend entirely for itself. The warmth itself was chosen freely and chosen fresh again every single day by the people actually living inside it, and that warmth was entirely real. The underlying necessity behind it, though, was never something anybody on that block actually chose for themselves. Both of those things, sitting side by side, remain completely true at the very same time. Your community turned deliberate exclusion into extraordinary, genuine solidarity, which stands as a real triumph of the human spirit by any fair measure, and it should never, under any circumstances, have been required of them in the first place. But out of that hard-won solidarity, out of that steeple, and that street, and that whole web of quietly held hands, something was steadily rising by the middle of this decade. Something the entire country was about to feel, whether it wanted to or not. Now something in the air itself begins, at last, to change. Remember Rosa, working through that same careful bus arithmetic all the way back at the very start of our long day together tonight. In December of 1955, she stays exactly where she's sitting, and a young preacher named Martin helps an entire city decide together to walk instead of ride for well over a full year. The churches organize their members block by block. The black press spreads the word steadily from one neighborhood to the next, and the heroes and the shoebox lunches and the 10,000 small survived indignities we've walked through together tonight all quietly add up in the end to a people who have finally, collectively decided they are done asking politely for what was always rightfully theirs. The 1950s don't merely endure Jim Crow passively. They begin, at long last, to actively end it. Let's return, one final time, to that bus, and to Rosa Parks specifically, because the popular version of her story tends to get one important detail wrong. She was never simply a tired seamstress who spontaneously refused to move her seat one random evening, on impulse. She was, in fact, a seasoned, long-time activist, a woman who had worked for justice for years already, who knew exactly what she was doing that particular evening, and who understood perfectly well exactly what it might cost her personally. When she declined to give up her seat in Montgomery that December evening in 1955, it was a genuine act of considered courage and firm conviction, not some spontaneous accident of fatigue. It was the deliberate strike of a match by someone who understood, with real clarity, that she was standing in a room already full of kindling, that an entire community had been quietly stacking for decades beforehand. And the community caught fire in response, not through violence, but through organized, thoroughly disciplined resistance instead. Black Montgomery made the collective decision to stop riding the city buses altogether until real change actually came. And they didn't sustain that boycott for a single day or even a single week. They walked on foot for well over an entire year. Think for a moment about what that kind of sustained commitment genuinely required. People who depended entirely on those buses to reach the very jobs that fed their families chose instead to walk for miles each day, to carpool wherever possible, to organize informal rides, and to wear out shoe after shoe rather than submit for even one more day to that daily, grinding humiliation. Every single mile walked amounted to a vote cast directly with a person's own 2 feet. The entire bus system's revenue bled steadily, month after month, because your community had simply, collectively, stopped participating in its own daily degradation. Notice now how practically every single thing we've discussed together throughout this long night finally clicks neatly into place as an essential tool of the fight. The churches, those same independent, tightly gathered, genuinely powerful institutions, became the movement's command centers, hosting the regular mass meetings, funding the sustained effort, rallying the people together week after week. The black press spread the word efficiently and carried the unfolding story out to the wider nation beyond Montgomery. The mutual aid networks organized the essential carpools and sustained the individual families who suffered real hardship for taking part in the boycott. The heroes of the previous decade had already modeled the necessary discipline. The barbershops and beauty shops had already rehearsed the underlying arguments for years. The women had already built the quiet backbone holding the entire effort together. The community wasn't starting from scratch that December. It had, in truth, been quietly building this exact machine, piece by piece, its entire life. And out of Montgomery stepped a young minister, new to the town, still barely into his 20s, thrust rather suddenly into a position of real leadership, and rising to meet it fully. Martin Luther King Jr. brought with him a clear philosophy that took everything the community had already painstakingly learned about maintaining dignity under relentless pressure. The same discipline Jackie Robinson had modeled on a baseball diamond, the same swallowed insult, the same head held consistently high, and forged all of it deliberately into a coherent strategy. Nonviolent resistance, meeting raw force with what he called soul force, a strategy that dared the entire country to look honestly at its own cruelty and at long last feel genuine shame about it. It was, in the end, the community's oldest survival skill, sharpened and turned for the first time into an active weapon for real change. The boycott in the end worked. The Montgomery buses were formally desegregated, and a whole watching nation saw plainly that walls which had looked permanently immovable could, in fact, be moved after all, that a people organized, disciplined, and utterly determined could genuinely shift what had looked, for generations, completely unshiftable. Montgomery marked a beginning, not an ending. The sit-ins, the marches, the freedom rides, the long, difficult, and often bloody fights still to come in the years ahead, all of it was now, at last, firmly in motion. The decade that had opened with a country still openly undecided about your basic humanity was closing with your community declaring plainly, unmistakably, and together, that the matter was no longer remotely open for debate. The 1950s held all of it, side by side, from beginning to end. The closed doors and the wide-open church. The shoebox lunches and the sundown roads driven carefully at dusk. The 10,000 small daily indignities and the 10,000 small daily mercies extended in return. And out of all of it together rose a people finally done asking politely for what had always, by right, belonged to them. Which brings us gently to the close of our long day together tonight. Now the day finally winds all the way down. The radios have been turned low. The little ones in the house are, at last, fully asleep. And you sit, for a few quiet minutes, in the stillness you fought hard all day long simply to earn for yourself. You think back over the closed doors and the open church, the boss's back entrance and the barbershop's warm, familiar welcome, the fear you carried with you all day, and the music that carried you steadily back in return. Tomorrow will ask exactly the same of you all over again, and you'll give it, the way you always have, without complaint. You lie back in a country that hasn't yet fully decided it deserves you, and you rest anyway with a stubborn, unshakable dignity that no sign hanging on any wall was ever going to manage to take from you. Sit here quietly with me for just a moment longer at the very end of this long day, and take the full measure of everything you carried through it, start to finish. You woke well before dawn, in a home the market had deliberately overcharged you for, and you pressed your one good shirt carefully until it could practically argue your case on your behalf. You rode a city bus that made you stand so that a complete stranger could sit comfortably instead. You worked steadily beneath a ceiling built deliberately low over your head, for wages kept deliberately thin. You navigated an entire world booby-trapped with painted signs, planned your own thirst carefully around a water fountain, planned your family's travel carefully around the position of the setting sun. You did every bit of it, start to finish, and you did it all with your back held straight the entire time. And when the doors of the wider world closed firmly in your face, and they closed often, and they closed hard, you turned around instead and found the doors that were genuinely open to you, the ones your own community had built with its own two hands, over generations. The church that made you a somebody again, every single Sunday without fail. The barbershop that set you free to speak your full mind. The press that told your truth when nobody else would print a word of it. The neighbors who filled in every gap before you ever had the chance to fall through it. The music that poured freely out through the screen doors on a warm night and lifted the entire weary block a little closer toward heaven. You were locked firmly out of one cold house, and so your people simply built a considerably warmer one instead, and gathered you safely inside it, and kept you there protected, for as long as you needed. Think for a moment about the sheer courage it actually took to live through all of this, day after day, the quiet, ordinary, largely uncelebrated kind of courage. The mother working 2 full shifts straight through, purely out of love for her family. The father getting his family safely home before the sun went all the way down. The parents teaching a small child to be both proud and appropriately careful in the very same breath, and somehow, against real odds, raising that child up whole and unbroken. A grieving mother finding it within herself to open a casket so an entire nation would finally be forced to see. A tired activist quietly keeping her seat on a crowded bus. A whole city choosing together to walk for over a full year rather than ride in submission. None of it came easily. All of it, in the end, was freely and deliberately chosen. This was a people who refused, day after ordinary day, to become anywhere near as small as the wider world kept insisting they should be. And you should know, as you finally settle in tonight, that none of it, in the end, was for nothing. The doors your own generation could only knock on, hopefully, your children would eventually walk straight through without a second thought. The vote so fiercely denied at the courthouse door would, in time, be fully won. The lunch counter that turned you away that afternoon would, before long, be desegregated by young people quietly sitting down on those very same stools. The walls that hemmed you in for an entire lifetime would, eventually, begin to come down, not all at once, and never without further struggle and further sacrifice than anyone should reasonably have had to give. But they would come down all the same, because a people had finally decided together that they absolutely must. So tonight, as you settle quietly into your own bed in your own home, in a country still, even now, working out exactly what it owes you, rest. You earned that rest 100 times over today, and you will go on to earn it again tomorrow, and the day after that. You carried an almost impossible weight today with genuinely impossible grace, and you passed down to your own children quietly, not merely the caution that kept them safe through it all, but also the deep pride that ultimately made them free. That pride outlived every single sign. It outlived every wall. It outlived every closed door put in its way. It's still here tonight, carried forward. It won in the end. Sleep now. The morning they fought so hard for is still coming steadily, and it is brighter than most of them ever quite got to see with their own eyes.